On this episode of Skeptiko, author of Evidence of the Afterlife, Dr. Jeffrey Long.
If there was any cause of brain dysfunction, hypoxia, chemicals, REM intrusion, anything that could possibly cause brain dysfunction and create hallucinatory, illusionary experiences, none of that is happening. So no question about that. What near-death experiencers see correlates to their time of cardiac arrest, and it is almost uniformly accurate in every detail. And that pretty much refutes the possibility that these could be illusionary fragments, unreal memories. It's a profound and reassuring message that we all have an afterlife, every single one of us, and it's wonderful. And it is probably the greatest thrill of my life to be able to carry forward that important message to the world. I wouldn't do it if I weren't absolutely convinced that it's correct. And I'll tell you something else, Alex. I have whole folders and entire files. I've gone over every skeptic argument I can get my hand on. I've processed it for hours and hours and hours. I have a folder titled, How Could We Be Wrong? And at the end of the day, after processing this at a depth that's far more than you could possibly have on your show, no doubt in my mind, carefully considering the evidence for and against, near-death experiences for real. And I'll tell you something else. I would be delighted to debate any near-death experience skeptic anytime, any place, on any media, as long as they're scholarly, very well informed, as long as it can be a very high-level intellectual debate.
Stay with us for Skeptiko.
Welcome to Skeptiko, where we explore controversial science with leading researchers, thinkers, and their critics. I'm your host, Alex Sakaris, and on today's show, I have an interview with Dr. Jeff Long, author of Evidence of the Afterlife. And as you'll hear, Dr. Long is probably one of the most qualified near-death experience researchers, and he's just compiled a huge body of that research into this book. This guy delivers the goods. I had a chance to interview him a few months ago for the documentary film that I've told some of you about that we're putting together, and he's on top of his game. A medical doctor, well qualified in the field of medicine, also a very accomplished researcher. I think you'll really enjoy this. I think if you like the kind of hard-nosed debate that really gets down to the issues, really gets down to the research, then you're really going to enjoy this dialogue. We talk directly about some of the points that were made by Dr. Kevin Nelson in the last episode of Skeptiko. I think you'll be interested to hear what he has to say about that. But then there's a whole new line of research and thought that he brings to this issue. So let's hear from Dr. Jeffrey Long. We're joined today by Dr. Jeff Long, who is an internationally recognized expert on near-death experiences and the author of Evidence of the Afterlife. And I was just chatting with Dr. Long here for a minute before we got on the phone, and he informed me that, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is now 8 days after the release of the book, a New York Times bestseller. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Well, congratulations on that, and welcome to the show, Dr. Jeffrey Long.
Well, it's good to be here. Thanks for the opportunity.
Dr. Long, fill people in real quickly a little bit, a quick sketch of your bio, your background, both as a physician and as someone who's become quite a well-known near-death experience researcher.
Sure. I'm a physician practicing the medical specialty of radiation oncology, which is the use of radiation to treat cancer. And I'm practicing at a premier cancer center in small-town Houma, Louisiana. I started my near-death experience research about 10 years ago when I set up a website devoted to having people that have had these exceptional experiences fill out a questionnaire, and then we would post their experience on the website, anonymously, of course, with their advance permission, and share it with the world. For over a decade, this was a nonprofit organization, actually costing us quite a bit of time and money to run it. But just very recently, we realized we had such an extraordinary message that we absolutely were compelled to share it with the world. And hence, several years ago, I began work on Evidence of the Afterlife, the Science of Near-Death Experiences. This is by far the largest scientific study of near-death experience ever published. It has over 1,300 near-death experiences, and because we're studying so many near-death experiences, we have the ability to come to some understandings about near-death experience that we just simply couldn't come to before with less extreme data than we have now. I might add, the near-death experiencers, not only are there so many of them, but the questionnaire they fill out, the current version has 150 questions. So it's also a huge number of near-death experiences studied, and they're also studied in enormous depth.
Great, and I would just interject from a prior conversation we had that the methodology that you use in collecting these surveys and analyzing the data is really quite extensive and designed to eliminate all the possible problems that come up with survey work. So this is just so folks know, you are not only an accomplished physician, but you know how to do research, and this is a well-done research project that is recognized in terms of the methods that are used.
Yeah, and that is a good point. Actually, just my medical curriculum vitae is 8 pages long, so I was very meticulous in making sure that the results of this survey and the conclusions we have would be scholarly and scientifically sound. You're correct.
What I wanted to jump into, because the book, Evidence of the Afterlife, is a great read. A lot of people will find it very meaningful for them. But what we've focused on this show on Skeptiko is really providing a forum for controversial research, and near-death experience research is controversial for very many people, but a forum for two sides to kind of square off on this. And as you know, I spoke recently to Dr. Kevin Nelson from the University of Kentucky, who is, I guess the only way to describe it, a near-death experience skeptic, a neurologist who's offered an alternative explanation for the near-death experience. And one of the ways I thought we could kind of jump into this dialogue and better understand where you're coming from on your near-death experience research is maybe compare and ask you to comment on some of Dr. Nelson's ideas. Would that be okay?
Yeah, that would be great. I actually helped recruit near-death experiencers for Dr. Nelson's research, so I've talked with him. I have a great deal of respect for Dr. Nelson and his scholarly approach, and I encourage all scholarly study of near-death experiences. And that's very important for everybody to know, but I certainly strongly disagree with Dr. Nelson's conclusions. Just in a nutshell, and again, this is not going to do fully justice, the very extensive article Dr. Nelson published in the very prestigious journal Neurology, but briefly, Dr. Nelson believes that many, if not all, of the elements of near-death experience can be explained by a phenomenon called REM intrusion. And REM is REM, and that's an abbreviation for rapid eye movement. And so what Dr. Nelson is proposing is that when people face a life-threatening event, they have that so-called fight or flight response. And as a result of that, the nervous system may create some type of, if you will, dreamlike, unrealistic images, which at the time of a life-threatening event and with borderline marginal consciousness may ultimately be considered to be the elements of a near-death experience. Now, again, I would emphasize that it's a very complex, very large article he has, but that's basically the gist of it. And the gist of it is that Dr. Nelson believes that what we're observing, near-death experiences, what people experience can, at least to a large degree, be based by this phenomenon of REM intrusion. As noted, my research that I've done, that I published in the book, as well as other scholarly research that precedes it, I think gives a completely different picture.
Why don't you tell us real briefly the methodology that Dr. Nelson used to arrive at his conclusions and how that compares to what you found and the methodology used? And I guess what I'm really driving at is Dr. Nelson, what he wound up doing was a survey in some respects similar to the survey work that you did, but he came at it with some different questions and obviously came away with some different conclusions.
Sure. Dr. Kevin Nelson, and working with me, we were able to recruit, I believe it was about approximately 55 people that had a near-death experience. And so as a result of that, he then did a survey, and he wanted to ask them, the near-death experiencers that he surveyed, he asked them 4 questions that were focused on whether they had a prior life experience of REM intrusion. And he compared that to the responses to a comparison group of people that he recruited from his own medical department, as well as from, as I understand, some other sources. And then when he compared the two groups, he found that people that had a near-death experience in as I recall, several of the questions that he asked had a statistically higher affirmative response to questions about a prior life history of REM intrusion. And that is the study that underlies his conclusions.
Great. And I don't want to bore people too much with the details of criticisms that you have of that, which I think are spelled out really well in the article that you sent me. But maybe you could give just, again, a thumbnail sketch of some of the problems you see in the way he went about that and the conclusions that he came to?
Well, first of all, in his very own published study, 40% of those that had a near-death experience answered no to all the REM intrusion questions he asked them, and that is a substantial minority, and that alone brings into serious question whether you can say REM intrusion underlies all near-death experiences. I think that almost single-handedly refutes that. But secondly, when the questions that he asked talked about visual and auditory experiences that weren't necessarily caused by REM intrusion. And so the problem is near-death experiencers that have had a very unusual, remarkable experience are certainly more attuned to possibility of encountering REM intrusions, whereas other people dismiss it. For example, I personally was waking up one morning and I heard my cell phone go off, and I heard it loud and clear, rang twice in the other room, and I was a little miffed that someone would call so early, so I said, well, I better get up, maybe it's important. Got up and the phone had not rang. I could be able to check see if anybody had actually called. Indeed, no one had. That was an episode of REM intrusion. It was an auditory hallucination occurring at the time of awakening. Now, because I have an interest in this and I'm fascinated with the phenomena, of course, I'm going to remember that the rest of my life. But other people that are, that aren't as interested in this kind of a topic, you'll forget about that. I mean, you won't even remember that happened a week later. So again, I think that's one of the real biases here. In the absence of a prospective study of near-death experiencers versus non-near-death experiencers, it's really hard to argue just from a differences in survey that's really a true difference in their life experience with prior life experience with REM intrusion. Near-death experiencers may simply be remembering it more than non-near-death experiencers, and that would be entirely plausible, especially if you've had a dramatic, unearthly experience like a near-death experience.
Okay.
One of the interesting concerns I had about Dr. Nelson's study is that the questions they asked just simply asked, have you ever had a prior life experience of REM intrusion? Well, the problem is, even for the near-death experiencers that said that they had, you don't know whether that so-called REM intrusion occurred prior to their near-death experience or whether it was actually an after effect precipitated by the near-death experience. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that they're more predisposed to have REM intrusion before they're in DE than anybody else. That study really isn't designed to do that. And I think that's a very, very important point, especially with near-death experiencers being much more interested in, kind of interesting non-normal phenomena in their life after an experience like that. So I think that's another major concern that I have of the Dr. Nelson study.
Okay. And let me just back up and get back into the bigger picture, because what I'm hearing you saying, and you did a very good job of laying out the particulars, is that there's some reason to maybe look twice at Dr. Nelson's conclusions, and you've laid out some of the reasons for that. But if we take a big step back, what really struck me in my conversation with Dr. Nelson is, I just have to say, not that here was a colleague, a fellow near-death experience researcher who was coming to the table and saying, gee, let me put my shoulder behind the wheel and find out what's really going on. I mean, what he led with is this burden of proof thing, that I think the burden of proof is on the individuals who are making these extraordinary claims, and the idea that consciousness is independent of the brain is a matter of faith, not of science. I mean, he came on with some very, very strong-minded language from this kind of skeptical position that we hear so many times from neurology types and folks who are very materialistic in their view of the world and say, this cannot happen under any circumstances. So let's deal with the burden of proof. These individuals are making extraordinary claims, and the burden of proof is on them. This is a matter of faith, not of science.
Oh, I'd be glad to address that. I think the concept that consciousness can exist apart from the body, the concept that near-death experiences are real, is absolutely, relative to the perspective of the scientific community, an absolutely exceptional, remarkable claim. So I personally have no problem facing the scientific community and saying, I couldn't agree more. This is an exceptional claim that near-death experiences are real, and therefore I willingly accept the burden of proof to prove that near-death experiences are real. Now here's the good news. Prior scholarly research has pretty much nailed down the reality of near-death experiences, and my most recent book took all the scholarly evidence that we have available to us. We did a lot of original research and really greatly extended the information we have that indicates that near-death experiences are absolutely real.
So you think that burden of proof issue, even if you take that on in its fullest, is addressed in evidence of the afterlife?
Absolutely, no question about that. In fact, in evidence of the afterlife, we have 9 lines of evidence that indicate the reality of near-death experiences and their consistent message of an afterlife. What each of these 9 lines of evidence do is carefully review all prior scholarly research on the subject, and we make our contributions with our original research from the work that I've done on the subject, and then we have written it up and put it in the book. And from my point of view, the scientific term is compelling, but you could put it another way. 9 lines of evidence that I presented, and an awful lot of other people believe who have read the book, consider this to be proof of the reality of near-death experiences, and proof at the level of you need exceptional evidence, Dr. Long, to prove that. Well, we're there. This book is a real game changer, to be frank about it, and I think this really changes the field. I would also say that, of course, Dr. Nelson could not have been aware of the content of this book. It was only released January 19th, but the content of the book and some of the original research that I've done and present is really some of the strongest evidence that we have available that near-death experiences are real.
Well, let's explore several of those lines of evidence, because one of them will be directly relevant to addressing Dr. Nelson's next point, and that's how do we know that the near-death experience is really happening in some cases, in any particular case, when there is a flat EEG?
Well, let's talk about some of the best evidence, the way I see it, that indicates that near-death experiences are not REM intrusion. REM intrusion is rapid eye movement, and that involves you have to have visual stimuli. Well, I think just the class of near-death experiences that single-handedly refutes REM intrusion as being the cause of all near-death experiences are those that occur in the blind, including the blind from birth. There have been case reports of these near-death experiences, not a lot of them, but they certainly are there. These people that are blind, totally blind from birth, have absolutely typical near-death experiences with very complete, detailed visual observations.
So never saw anything during their life, don't have any sense of color. Their sense of color is based on either a sense of smell or feeling, or they've used their other senses, and now they have a near-death experience and they report seeing things. Is that correct?
Absolutely. You cannot explain vision to somebody totally blind from birth in terms of their remaining 4 senses. It's absolutely impossible. So for them to have vision for the first time in their life during a near-death experience is incredible. The people that are blind from birth, do not have REM intrusion. They can't. It's physiologically impossible. So the fact that they have typical near-death experiences, if you will, single-handedly refutes REM intrusion underlying all near-death experiences. At an absolute minimum, clearly there's something going else other than REM intrusion in some near-death experiences just based on this. A REM intrusion absolutely cannot explain that.
Let me jump to another point, because this has come up not only with Dr. Nelson but with other neurologist types, and that's this idea of a flat EEG. You get to the point where you say, okay, we have medical evidence that people were being monitored when they had cardiac arrest and they had EEG monitoring. They had a flat EEG. They still report a near-death experience. Do we have any evidence at all that would suggest that in any instance ever that their near-death experience occurred while they had a flat EEG?
Well, certainly the best evidence that the near-death experience is occurring during the time of their cardiac arrest comes from the out-of-body experiences that about 45% of near-death experiencers report. Let me back up a minute. When you have a cardiac arrest, which means your heart stops, immediately blood stops flowing to the brain. Unconsciousness occurs within seconds, and within about 10 to 20 seconds of people that have a cardiac arrest, the EEG electroencephalogram, or measurement of brain electrical activity, goes absolutely flat. During that period in time, it is impossible to have an organized conscious experience. However, that's the time when near-death experiencers have it. How do I know that? Well, that's easy. I and prior researchers have considered how realistic these out-of-body experience observations are. There's no question when people have a near-death experience, what they're reporting is occurring at the time where there's frantic resuscitations ongoing. It's very typical that they return to their body after they've been defibrillated, or the paddles have been placed and shocked, if you will, in the vernacular. But certainly they're actually observing earthly ongoing events, again, about 45% of near-death experiencers at this time. What I did is I looked at over 280 near-death experiences that had out-of-body observations of earthly ongoing events, and I looked for any hint that any detail of what they were reporting was unrealistic. In other words, if NDEs were just fragments of memory, unrealistic remembrances of a time approaching unconsciousness or returning from unconsciousness, there is no chance that the observations, there'd be a high percent of completely accurate observations. They'd be dreamlike or hallucinations, and the hallmark of what they observed in the out-of-body experience would be unreal. Is that what we observe? The answer is absolutely not. In my review of these over 280 near-death experiences, 98% of them were entirely realistic by my assessment of these out-of-body observations, as well as the near-death experiencer who shared it also believing that there was no error in what they saw whatsoever. And they didn't really, at least they did not report that they had any reservations whatsoever about the accuracy of what they saw. So we're talking about an overwhelmingly high percentage of people with entirely realistic observations in every detail. And in fact, these observations of earthly ongoing events often include observations of things that would be impossible for them to be aware of with any sensory function from their physical body. Very common, the consciousness rises above their body. They can see the tops of buildings. They can see far away. They can see outside walls. And just about every single time a near-death experiencer reports that, their observations are absolutely correct. And in fact, of my study series of these out-of-body observations during near-death experiences, over 60 of these near-death experiencers later went back and independently attempted to verify or refute what they saw in the out-of-body state. Every single one of these over 60 near-death experiences that reported checking or verifying their own observations found that they were absolutely correct in every detail. There's no question about that. If there was any cause of brain dysfunction, hypoxia chemicals, REM intrusion, anything that could possibly cause brain dysfunction and create hallucinatory, illusionary experiences, none of that is happening. And I might add that there's been a prior scholarly study of over 90 near-death experiencers where they found 92% of the observations of these NDEs in the OBE state were accurate in every single detail. So no question about that. What near-death experiencers see correlates to their time of cardiac arrest, and it is almost uniformly accurate in every detail. And that pretty much refutes the possibility that these could be illusionary fragments, unreal memories associated with REM intrusion or anything else.
Well, great. I mean, I think you couldn't have addressed that more directly, but I'm going to go back and hit it one more time with the exact language that Dr. Nelson used, because what he said is that this is a common misconception and that cardiac arrest doesn't mean that there's no blood flow to the brain and that they could be going in and out of a conscious experience. Now, also by implication, he's suggesting that everyone who has a near-death experience is going through that state of having some blood flow and going in and out of consciousness. That would have to be part of his assumption, because obviously in this case, if there's any one particular case where there's zero blood flow, where there's a complete flat EEG, no gag reflex, no that. I mean, one case kind of opens the whole door here. So let's just nail that completely.
Well, let's start with nailing that down first, because I've got a lot to say to that. In addition to my study and another retrospective study that I addressed about how realistic out-of-body observations were, there have been two separate prospective studies that have done of people that have had cardiac arrest. And then these researchers studied the entire group. Some had near-death experiences and some don't. The group was asked, both groups were asked to describe their resuscitation efforts. Those that had near-death experiences and those that observed their own resuscitation efforts were incredibly accurate, typically down to even very, very fine, minute details, if they had a near-death experience and saw their own resuscitation. On the other hand, the control group, that being those that had a cardiac arrest and did not have a near-death experience, their recount of their out-of-body observations were generally highly inaccurate. So we actually have two separate studies, both of which pointing to the fact that it is the near-death experience. It is that experience that allows accurate out-of-body observations. That pretty much excludes the possibility that it's this drifting in and out of consciousness or anything else. No doubt about it, what people see during a near-death experience, both by large retrospective studies and prospective studies, are verified as accurate.
And I think anyone who bothers to really dig into your book evidence of the afterlife is going to get a real good sense of that. So let me back up then for a minute and hit another point that you touch on in the article that you wrote for the Journal of Near-Death Experience addressing Dr. Nelson's points. And that's this. Why do you think the scientific community is so welcoming of these alternative explanations for the near-death experience, even when when we analyze them carefully, are on some pretty shaky grounds relative to the larger body of near-death experience scholarly work that we have, including yours and other near-death experience researchers?
Yeah, that's a good question. First of all, as an overview, there's certainly a lot of other explanations for near-death experiences other than REM intrusion. And in fact, skeptics of the near-death experience have proposed over 20. That's right, over 20 different alternative explanations for near-death experience that span the spectrum of physiologic so-called causes, psychological, sociological, culturally determined causes. And the reason that there's so many of these alternative, quote, explanations, unquote, out there is that these skeptical explanations of near-death experience, no one or several of them make sense even to the skeptics.
Right.
So I think that's an important point. I mean, certainly the skeptics can't really point to any one or several explanations and say, aha, this must be it because the evidence is so solid. Even the skeptics themselves realize that there's a huge number of different explanations because they can't agree on what really makes sense. And so that's a really important point as you look at skeptical arguments. There's a lot of them. So the question is, and an important question you raise, why isn't there more scientific acceptance of the hundreds of scholarly articles that have been written about near-death experience? And I might add, and these are in some of the world's most prestigious medical journals, and that's absolutely a fact. Well, I think that one of the biggest issues is that the concept that consciousness can exist apart from the body is radically different from any other, from a concept that the conventional scientific community has. As we've said before, especially to the scientific community, these type of exceptional claims, that being the reality of near-death experience, really does require some exceptional evidence. And I think the concept that near-death experiences are real and consciousness can exist apart from the body is such a radical concept for scientists that it's very, very hard for them to accept that. In fact, I think it's such a shift from the way they've been taught and the research that they do that in general it's hard for them to even get interested in studying in depth the scholarly literature that underlies the concept that near-death experiences are real.
I think they're afraid how far down the bunny hole they're going to fall and what it's going to do to the mountains and mountains of work they've accumulated in their career. I mean, folks say that directly. I mean, what would that do to my career?
Yeah, that would and that would be a real issue. I think probably more commonly the issue is that they just simply can't believe it. I mean, if it's so outside of their life experience and if it's something that is not a part of their prior belief system, in general, people on just about anything will seize on any kind of evidence or line of thinking to negate or not be interested in anything that challenges their belief system. I think that's just a naturally human response, and scientists are no different. But of course, the people that have had a near-death experience, essentially 100% of them come back being very convinced of its reality. And the interesting thing is that includes near-death experiencers that were scientists, physicians themselves. If they ever doubted near-death experience before, once they have one, they come back, grow to understand it, they accept the reality of near-death experience. So again, there's no substitute for personal experience, and if you haven't had a personal experience with an NDE, then it's just very, very difficult to accept that such a remarkable experience is real.
Absolutely. Dr. Long, I think you wanted to mention one other line of evidence that you think really comes into play prominently.
Yeah, I have 9 lines of evidence. I think, any one or several are certainly very convincing to a lot of people, but I think another line of evidence that really refutes the possibility that REM intrusion or any functioning of the physical brain whatsoever has anything to do with near-death experiences are those near-death experiences that occur while the person is under general anesthesia. If you have the only explanation for a conscious experience while under general anesthesia is that you're not under general anesthesia, that you have partial awakening. That's very, very rare. No more than 2 or 3 in 1,000 anesthesias have any of that. I don't want to frighten anybody about.
Hey, let me stop you there, Dr. Long, because the first time that we talked a few months ago, I had to. It really came as somewhat of a surprise to me, not for other folks, but for me. I didn't really realize how deep anesthesia is. So for the common layperson like me, tell us a little bit about what being under anesthesia really means.
Yeah, for those that have had a personal experience with anesthesia, you go to sleep, you wake up, and your time under general anesthesia is a totally blank slate. I've given anesthesia, and even when I was a medical student, and I've been there with lots of patients that have general anesthesia. And usually, when you're under general anesthesia, you're under so deep that there's absolutely no possibility of a conscious experience. Once again, electroencephalogram measurements, or measurement of brain electrical activity under general anesthesia, show complete disorganization. Once again, proof that there's no possibility of a conscious experience under adequate general anesthesia. In fact, moreover, very often the people are so deep asleep that they have to be artificially ventilated, which means there's machines that breathe for them, because if you didn't, they're so deep under general anesthesia they die due to lack of breathing. So that's how profoundly unconscious people are while under general anesthesia. Mm-hmm. And yet this is the time that people have near-death experiences. In my research, we had a population of 23 near-death experiences that to me were quite convincingly occurred under general anesthesia, and I compared 33 near-death experience elements of these people under general anesthesia with all other near-death experiences occurring under all other circumstances. And in comparing those 33 elements statistically between the two groups, for 32 of the 33 elements, there was absolutely no statistical difference at all between the two groups. In other words, these people are having essentially identical near-death experience content, whether they're under general anesthesia or not. And this has been observed by other researchers as well, and there's multiple other near-death experience reports that occur under general anesthesia. I would argue that if you had even a single established proven near-death experience under general surgery, that would prove it. But there's actually dozens out there that have been reported, including in my own study. And the fact that the content is absolutely the same as all other near-death experiences, once again, almost single-handedly refutes that these experiences are due to any possible physical brain function.
Great. That is very convincing evidence. So then real quickly, Dr. Long, what is coming up for you in the near future?
Well, certainly we're going to, continue to spread the word about my book, Evidence of the Afterlife. Now that it's a New York Times bestseller, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of interest, and certainly we'll be involved in a number of media presentations. And Alex, sure appreciate your interest. A lot of people have a lot of interest in this book so far, and that's exciting to me since it's my first book, and I really worked very hard to make sure that it was scholarly and factual.
I'm sorry, but you've also hit some very big outlets. You're on Today's Show, and what are some of the other? Oh, yeah,
Coast to Coast AM. I think we've got at least several more TV shows going up in the near future, and that's going to probably more and more media contacts and media involvement is probably going to happen within the next few weeks. I just found out I was a New York Times bestseller yesterday afternoon, so that's certainly going to open some doors in terms of some other media presentations. I think in wrapping it up, I think I'd like to talk about the overall way in which we determine the reality of near-death experiences. There's certainly going to be the skeptics, and there's certainly going to be those that firmly believe that near-death experiences are real and evidence of the afterlife, such as myself. When Kevin Nelson wrote his article, we wrote a very careful response to the evidence exactly as he presented it. In fact, we sent that article to Kevin Nelson prior to publishing it and made it very clear that if he had any response to that, we would be very interested, and I'm sure we'd publish it. And we heard no such response from Kevin Nelson. Now I have the book out. We have all the evidence for the reality of near-death experience. I think if we're going to, as a society, really, and scientific community of a variety of people with a lot of opinions on this, both for and against, if we're really going to nail down the reality of near-death experiences, both the skeptics and the proponents of the reality of near-death experience need to have the courtesy of responding to the evidence as presented on the other side, not what we wish the evidence was, but we really need to have that scholarly, in-depth understanding of what the other side is presenting. And we tried to do that with Kevin Nelson, and unfortunately we haven't heard back a direct response from that article that we published in the Journal of Near-Death Studies. I would hope that Kevin Nelson or any other skeptic would do me the courtesy of carefully reviewing the evidence in my book, as well as the, if you will, the synopsis of all scholarly research, both pro and con, that I present in my book, along with my 9 lines of evidence for the reality of near-death experience. I would hope that we would have the courtesy and frankly, the integrity to respond directly to what the evidence of near-death experience is based on scholarly studies. If we, simply hang to a belief system, if we're not willing to address the evidence, whether for and against near-death experience, we're really not doing anybody, if we're really not advancing the scholarly understanding of near-death experience.
That's very well said. And really pulling that apart, it's basic science. I mean, that is the definition of science.
Yeah, science, I think true science involves addressing the evidence. In fact, a basic scientific principle is that which is real is consistently observed. I have over 1,300 near-death experiences in my research database. There's no question that that is a consistent observation. You cannot use the term anecdote when you talk about a research database that's that great. And moreover, basically all of my major points for evidence for the reality of near-death experience is very nicely corroborated by prior large scholarly study of near-death experience. So not only the depth of my own research, but the consistent observation of other researchers with different study groups finding the exact same thing creates, I think, the body of evidence that I would hope that skeptics would have the courtesy, if not the integrity, to respond to directly instead of responding to something other than that real database, that real set of knowledge that we have about near-death experiences. I think for the readers of my book, for the readers that really read in depth both pro and con the evidence for near-death experience, I think the light will come shining through for what the reality really is in all this, and that is, without a shadow of a doubt, near-death experiences are real.
Dr. Long, best of luck with this important work.
I sure appreciate that, Alex. This has been a real pleasure. Good luck. I sure appreciate your willingness to have a dialogue between proponents and skeptics of near-death experience. You're doing a tremendous public service. The more people know about the argument, both for and against, I think the better off we. Alex, one other thing I might leave you with. Certainly the arguments for and against near-death experience can be somewhat complex, and it's hard for people to understand how powerful it is when you have multiple lines of evidence for the reality of NDE. One thing I've done to help people sort out how strongly they believe in the reality of NDE is actually on my website. If you go to www.nderf.org/afterlife, you can see the 9 lines of evidence briefly summarized in my book. People can decide for themselves how convincing each line of evidence is for the reality of near-death experience and its consistent message of an afterlife. And then when you hit the calculate button at the bottom, you can see what that combination of evidence and exactly what they believe, how strongly each individual believes how strong that evidence is. Each person can calculate for themselves how strongly they believe in the reality of near-death experience from that calculation engine.
That sounds fascinating. I haven't seen that myself, so I'm going to go there, and we'll definitely point all our listeners there with a link in the show notes. So super, and thanks again so much for joining us.
Been a pleasure, Alex. Have a great day, and thank you all, listeners.
Thanks again to Dr. Long for joining me today on Skeptiko. If you'd like more information on Dr. Long's book, a link to the assessment that he talked about, please visit the Skeptiko website. It's at skeptiko. Don't forget the K. And there you'll also find links to all our previous shows, a bunch of links where you can connect with me. Really enjoy hearing from you on Facebook, on Twitter, or dropping me an email. And you'll also find a link to our forum where you can engage in more of a lengthy discussion on these topics. So that'll do it for today. I have several other interesting projects that I need to update you on and interviews that are in the can, just waiting to get out there. So as fast as I can, I'll get them out to you Skeptiko listeners. Take care, and bye for now.
On this episode of Skeptiko, near-death experience skeptic, Dr. G.M. Woerlee.
Ultimately, when you look at the total body of evidence explaining the physiological or biological basis of the near-death experience, the out-of-body experience, and the other experiences reported by those undergoing near-death experiences, you come to the conclusion that most of them, in fact all of them, can be explained by body function.
Stay with us for Skeptiko.
Welcome to Skeptiko, where we explore controversial science with leading researchers, thinkers, and their critics. I'm your host, Alex Sakaris, and on this episode of Skeptiko, I have coming up an interesting interview with someone who's very skeptical of the near-death experience, and in particular, skeptical of the work of Dr. Jeffrey Long. Dr. Long, as many of you know, is a prominent near-death experience researcher, and he appeared on Skeptiko a few episodes back to talk about his new book, Evidence of the Afterlife. So Dr. Woerlee, who we're going to hear from today, has written quite an extensive critique of that book and of the near-death experience in general. It's quite a long interview, and I also want to alert you to the fact that Dr. Long has agreed to come back on Skeptiko and respond specifically to the points that Dr. Woerlee raises. So without anything further, let's hear from Dr. G.M. Woerlee. We're joined today by someone well qualified to enter into a discussion on the evidence of survival of consciousness and the near-death experience. Dr. G.M. Woerlee is a well-respected anesthesiologist in the Netherlands, a frequent lecturer in his field, and an author of 3 books, including Mortal Minds, The Biology of Near-Death Experiences. Dr. Woerlee, welcome to Skeptiko.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here. I would like to add one other point, and that is that I've also written another book, and that is called The Unholy Legacy of Abraham, which uses the biology of near-death experiences and explains it rather more fully.
Great, and we might also point out that that second book that you mentioned is available as a free download to anyone. If I think that's correct, right?
That's correct.
And we'll have a link to that in the Skeptiko show notes, so as well as a link to the article that we're going to talk mostly about today, and that's this critique that you offered to Dr. Jeffrey Long's book, Evidence of an Afterlife. That's what we're going to focus the main part of our discussion about today, and you've really written quite an extensive critique of that, and I thought it would be a great opportunity to have you on and get your perspective. So, we have a lot of information I'd like to try and cover today. Between Dr. Long's book and your critique, there's quite a lot to sort through. So let me start by attempting to give a little bit of a big picture summary, and you can see if you think this is accurate or not.
Okay.
Great. So both you and Dr. Long have looked at the near-death experience phenomena at some depth, and Dr. Long thinks that his research and the research of other folks in the field is highly suggestive that consciousness somehow, in some way, survives death. In other words, he finds reason to believe these NDEers who think they've experienced what we all call an afterlife. And then you, on the other hand, believe that there's a more physiological explanation for what's going on, and you mainly focus on the hypothesis that NDEers are in fact conscious in a normal way through the faculties of their brain when they're having these experiences. Is that more or less correct?
Yeah, that's more or less correct. In fact, I've read the book of Jeffrey Long extensively, and also I'm very familiar with most other near-death experience research, and those are indeed my conclusions, that the persons undergoing a near-death experience are indeed undergoing a real experience. It's a profound experience. It even has sometimes a life-changing effect, and it's a real human experience. But I do not agree that the explanation is a supernatural or paranormal one. I believe these people are indeed conscious. But that brings us then to another subject of what is a near-death experience.
Yes. And, actually, before we even sort that out, let me lay the groundwork for how we're going to proceed, because, what you did in your critique, which I thought was really good and helpful in terms of analyzing someone's, claims, in this case, Dr. Long's claims, is you followed the format that he did. He lays out in his book 9 lines of evidence that he believes are highly suggestive of the near-death experience, suggesting an afterlife, and then you go point by point. So that's how I thought we'd proceed here. And before we jump into those 9 lines, the first thing I guess I'd do is touch on something that you touched on in your introduction and just touched on real briefly there, and that is the research that Dr. Long has done. Because I think when I talk to some folks who are skeptical and maybe unfamiliar with the importance and the use of surveys in medical research, they may not be aware of, how to look at this. Is survey really a valid way of looking at medical information? And then they have questions about whether this particular survey is 600 people looking at 600 cases, Dr. Long's research, population. Is that enough? And, he had this questionnaire. It's 150 questions, pretty extensive, but is that enough? So what folks are telling me is that this kind of research, this kind of survey research with that kind of database, properly reviewed, properly constructed, is a reasonable way to kind of collect these accounts. Would you care to kind of weigh in on that at all?
I would indeed. The thing is that surveys are very powerful instruments, but they should be used very carefully. What you actually have in the case of Dr. Long is a good survey questionnaire, an extensive one. I've looked at it. But the problem is that the people who respond to it are the ones with a story to tell. So often the people with a story to tell will respond to these surveys, and people with a less of a story or with no experience whatsoever, they will not respond at all to the survey. So what you actually have is a bias of the responders. And so in other words, it's like you send out a survey to 1,000 people, you get 400 replies back, completed surveys back, and you base your story on the 400 you've got that were returned. But the other 600, you've not heard nothing from them. So it depends on what sort of survey are you doing and what is the purpose of the survey. If you are just orienting yourself as to what is possibly going on, then a survey such as Dr. Long's is quite good in the sense that it will show you, these points are the ones we've got to look for and look at and examine. But it will not tell you any more than that.
Okay, that's interesting. I'm not sure how that will kind of play itself out in the content that we're going to talk about, but I think that's a point that we'll leave out there and leave on the table for further discussion. The other point that I want to bring up is something that you mentioned in the introduction to your critique, and that's this idea that Dr. Long is essentially arguing this God of the gaps argument. And in your article, you suggest that, he's confronting scientific uncertainty, areas where we don't know what's going on, and he's maybe interjecting that with the presumption that, well, if there's a gap there, then God must be there.
Well, I'm not actually saying that it is God in this case, but the God of the gaps argument is a well-known theological argument, commonly used by intelligent design people and creationists of all types, but it's also commonly used in science. And in fact, but in this particular case, I call it the God of the gaps argument because this is an argument familiar to most people. And in the case of Jeffrey Long, what he does in his book is he has 9 lines of evidence, as he calls them, and he tries, in some of them, to provide a scientific explanation, and then he cannot provide an explanation, so he says, yes, this is inexplicable, therefore the cause must be supernatural, or the cause must be that there really is an afterlife. And that's the system of argument consistently used throughout the book. In the examination of every one of these 9 lines.
Okay, so that'll be another point we'll just kind of leave on the side and let listeners decide, because you make a point there. I guess I would come back and say I didn't really read it that way. I mean, I read it as someone who was approaching a topic where there are admittedly a lot of gaps. I mean, when we get into the whole area of consciousness in general, let alone survival of consciousness, death, clinical death, and all the definitions we can go through that, we all realize there's a lot of gaps. So I think what he's tried to do is fill in those gaps the best he can with the best science that's available. And I think that you could make the argument that the other side, whatever that side is, materialistic neuroscience or whatever, can be just as guilty of trying to fill in those gaps as well by saying, well, we don't know what's going on, but we'll figure it all out and it'll all map to neural correlates. I mean, that's also filling in the gaps. So I'm willing to leave the gaps be gaps and just say, what's the best evidence we have? And maybe that's all you're calling for too.
No, not quite the same way. The thing is that when I see a gap, I say, this is unknown, and okay, let's leave it at that at the moment and see if we can't approach the problem in a different way and also find a solution. Instead of saying, oh, there's a gap, therefore the explanation must be something quite different. There are many ways, there are many fields of physiology, chemistry, and in medicine where basically this type of gap does exist. And people then go on basically empirical explanations. But, and that is the difference between Jeffrey Long and my approach, and that I try and find an explanation. I keep puzzling and puzzling until, and that is what most skeptics or scientists will do, and not call it a gap which needs a different type of explanation altogether until you've actually exhausted all other possibilities. I do not find that Dr. Long does this.
Well, I would have to kind of take a point with that, is that I do think you fill in those gaps when you say, we don't have any knowledge of this at this point, but we're going to discover it someday. I mean, these are these promissory notes that kind of get issued that say someday we're going to fill in this gap. So I think what he's doing is saying, here's from the empirical evidence that I have, here's the possible explanation, and it's sending us in a different direction in terms of theories that have to be played out, but he's looking at the evidence too. So I don't know, I can leave that alone for now, but if you have anything else to say about that, please go ahead.
Well, I think that basically he has looked at he has done some serious research. He has a large database of near-death experience reports, a very good one, I assume, because it's more than 1,300, 1,600, or whatever number of cases. It's large. And so he has a large database. But the problem is that in his book, he seems to accept these explanations at face value. The problem is that he does two things. One, he views the near-death experience as a unitary phenomenon. That means, regardless of the cause, the near-death experience is the same all the way around for all people. But when you look at near-death experience causes, you see they arise during cardiac arrest, they arise during anesthesia, when there is absolutely no question of brain oxygen starvation, but only effects of drugs. Cardiac arrest, you have drugs, brain oxygen starvation. They also arise during people who jump from the Golden Gate Bridge. And these people are certainly not oxygen starved, and they are not under the effect of drugs. There have been interviews of survivors of these jumpers. There are also people who have near-death experiences basically due to fear of execution, fear of other things, or anxiety attacks. So the cause is very different. The final common pathway, as we call it in medicine and biochemistry, is the experience. And this is a profound experience with several characteristics, and these are what Dr. Long also refers to. So that's basically, so the near-death experience is not entirely the same thing. You've also got to look at the cause. And Dr. Long, he has a large database, and he fails to actually look at the cause, except in one particular case where he mentions that he studied near-death experiences during anesthesia and compared them to other near-death experiences. And he found that these people reported more darkness and tunnel experiences. Okay, and that was the only difference. I find this rather sad, actually, because Dr. Moody, in in 1975, actually it's 1973, it was the first publication of his book Life After Life, did also a very similar study, or admittedly with far fewer patients, and came up with the same characteristics. So I found myself very disappointed in that regard.
I just actually see that as more evidence to support his conclusions. I mean, as you say, he has a large database. He's looked at many different cases with many different causes of the NDE. I'm not sure all the causes that you mentioned would really qualify as true NDEs, but leaving that aside for a minute, if we look at most of the ones you mentioned, I'm sure there'd be agreement there. But then the real question is, if we have all of these different causes, why would we expect to have such similarity in the experiences? But let's use that point as a jumping off point to jump into these 9 points, because I think it'll help structure what we're talking about.
Yep.
And the first point that you address is Dr. Long's contention that these patients experience a lucid death, and that it's medically inexplicable to have a highly organized, lucid experience while unconscious or clinically dead. So why don't you tell us your response to that?
Well, I'll begin by first talking about clinical death. Many people who talk about near-death experiences or write about them talk about the phenomenon of clinical death. What do they actually mean? It is often, in many of these more simple books, defined as basically absence of breathing, absence of heartbeat, and in particular, absence of heartbeat. In fact, when you look at many of these things, the evidence that most people consider the hardest is the evidence of near-death experiences occurring during cardiac arrest. In that case, there is people have a demonstrated cardiac arrest. That means their heart has stopped beating or is beating so abnormally that it no longer pumps blood. Several good studies have been done of the speed at which consciousness is lost and the electrical activity of the brain ceases. And usually this first good study was done in 1943 in an American prison by Lieutenant Colonel Rossen and a certain Kabat, and published in the Journal of Medical of Mental and Science at the time. A good study. And then several more recent ones like Aminoff in the 80s with turning off pacemakers, also Visser in 2001. They all come to the same conclusion. Within 4 to 30 seconds, all electrical activity measurable as an electroencephalogram ceases. Okay. And Dr. Pim van Lommel, who performed one of the better studies, prospective studies of near-death experiences in the Netherlands, with 300 and a bit numbers of patients, I can't remember the exact figure, he also stated the same in his article in The Lancet. What he then further forgot to say was, the people that are interviewed after a cardiac arrest have all survived. In other words, they are alive to tell the tale. And why are they alive? Because they received heart massage. Heart massage means that someone energetically presses on the chest to generate a sort of pumping action of the heart. Without heart massage, a person with a cardiac arrest simply is dead, very dead. And they do not come back to tell their story. So what you actually have is cardiac massage generates a flow of blood. This flow of blood has actually been measured in a number of studies. Not many studies, and you have to look very carefully in all the scientific literature to find actually some studies where this actually was measured. And usually in around 20% of cases to about 40% of cases, enough blood flow is generated by cardiac massage to sustain consciousness. And I say potentially to sustain consciousness. That doesn't mean it automatically does. Then we come to the matter. So, and what people describe during their near-death experiences during cardiac massages, they saw the people working upon them, or they heard people rushing to them in the case that they were in a coronary care unit and the heart suddenly stopped pumping. Okay, they got 30 seconds to hear people running towards them, because they're conscious for these 30 seconds, and they can hear, even though they have no heartbeat. It's a commonly heard complaint on coronary care units, for example, where people suddenly the heartbeat, some people suddenly stops. They complain bitterly when they're jumped upon by whole piles of doctors and nurses and defibrillated, because they complain bitterly about the pain of the cardiac massage and also the pain of the defibrillation. Now, in fact, a lot of experiments in America and even medical practice in the United States with artificial hearts clearly demonstrates that heartbeat, or actual heartbeat, is not really needed for consciousness. Because, for example, in the Jewish hospital in I believe, Louisville in Kentucky, as well as in the LDH hospital in Arizona, as well as in several other large medical institutions where they do heart transplantations, some people are so sick, their hearts are so diseased, they cannot survive the period of waiting until a donor heart becomes available. So what is done in some cases is take out the old heart, put in a mechanical heart. It is just a machine to pump blood around, and you connect that to a battery-driven pneumatic unit, and the people can go home and live for a few months until a donor heart becomes available. This is standard practice in some places in the U.S. where enough money and facilities are available to provide this highly technical and medical service. So in other words, what you're actually doing with cardiac massage is something very similar. The heart is not beating, but you induce, due to heart massage, a pumping action which pumps blood around. Now, most people during heart massage or during a cardiac arrest are not at all and never attached to an electroencephalograph. That's very rare. In fact, most people, they fall down in the street or they suddenly have a heart attack in a ward or another place in the hospital. Electroencephalograph is never attached for the very simple reason it's very difficult to do that at the same time as someone's receiving heart massage. So, in fact, the presumption that all these people were flat-lined at the time is only a presumption. And in fact, no one actually of these people in the research of Dr. Tim von Lommel or Sam Pania and other people ever had an electroencephalograph machine attached to their heads. So the presumption of flatlining is purely an assumption because they remember, yes, electroencephalographic activity ceases after 4 to 30 seconds, and okay, in that case they're flatlined, and they forget the action of the cardiac massage, which is to pump blood around the body.
Okay, a couple of points there. I mean, one, I think it's good that you remind us, which we often forget when we're talking about death, near death, that we're talking about the folks that come back to life. And I think that's a valid point.
Yeah.
But I still have a couple of pretty big problems with your argument. And the first is that the people who die, particularly those that have a heart attack, because it's easier to study because we know the physiology.
Okay.
Well, they're not supposed to have the kind of experiences that Dr. Long found. I mean, one point that you just mentioned was pain.
Exactly.
Right. So in particular, these people complain about pain from the defibrillator, pain from people pounding on their chest, and yet Dr. Long's survey finds that there isn't this pain. That doesn't appear at all, hardly at all in the surveys. And the other thing I guess I would just interject while we're talking about heart massage and that, and I don't know this, but one of my listeners contacted me, and his sister, I think, is an emergency care nurse, and said that, really the most common procedure when someone is in hospital and has cardiac arrest is that defibrillator, pounding on the chest is like secondary. The first thing to do is go over and zap them with the paddles, and that a lot of times the heart massage doesn't start for, it's kind of the last resort many minutes later. But all that leads back to this, what you're alluding to, and we really have to break it down, right? Because there's 3 parts to this process, particularly when we look at cardiac arrest. There's that 10 to 15 seconds between when the heart stops and the brain stops. And then there's, and we know, I mean, our best medical knowledge says that the brain is under a lot of stress, and it shouldn't be lucid and coherent during that time. And then the second part we have is when the brain is flatlined or dead, or we can assume, nothing is happening. There hasn't been any attempt to resuscitate this person. And during that time, we definitely don't have any explanation for why they would have a conscious experience. And then the third part, as you are alluding to, and you mentioned, I think quite rightly, that now we're getting blood flow back to the brain. So there is a chance for some conscious experience. But again, I'm going to rely on you here, but doesn't our best medical knowledge tell us that, again, during that process of resuscitation, the brain coming back online after it's been dead, we wouldn't expect it to be lucid and coherent? I mean, isn't just the opposite the normal expectation of how that brain is working during that time?
Oh, they're all interesting problems, and in fact, they can be answered. To begin with, a person who has a cardiac arrest, they have a short period of consciousness when they can hear people rushing to the bed if they're in a coronary care unit. And as you quite correctly say, in a coronary care unit, the first thing they do is defibrillate people. Out on the street or elsewhere in the hospital, they don't have this luxury. So they first do cardiac massage, and that is what most people undergo. Then we come to the point of, does cardiac massage, as I explained, does restore a flow of blood to the brain, but does this restore any electrical activity to the brain? That's an interesting question. And in fact, there are several studies which do show, and also case reports which do show that this is the case. What you actually have during a cardiac arrest is the blood flow to the brain stops. This means within seconds, the brain becomes oxygen starved. No one denies this. This is because the brain has actually no reserve store of oxygen. The brain becomes oxygen starved, and then when you have cardiac massage, there's a flow of blood is restored, sometimes sufficient to sustain consciousness. One study, which was done by a patient where they actually had an EEG or an electroencephalograph. I'll use the longer term because the Americans use ECG instead of electroencephalograph, while in Europe we use EEG, so it's a bit confusing for many people. Anyway, so they actually had an electroencephalograph attached to the brain of to the head of this person. He had a cardiac arrest. The electroencephalographic activity fell away as expected, and heart massage was applied, or cardiac massage, whatever you like to call it. And within 20 seconds after cardiac massage was instituted, electrical brain activity was restored. Similarly, other studies have been done with bispectral analysis apparatus. That's a method of sort of integrated electroencephalograph used to monitor awareness during anesthesia. Some people have had this apparatus attached to their brain, or to the head basically, at the same during anesthesia, and during that period they developed a cardiac arrest. During cardiac massage, bispectral activity reappeared. In other words, electroencephalographic activity reappeared. So in fact, cardiac massage can restore electroencephalographic activity if applied efficiently. It will not occur in all people because not everyone is expert at applying cardiac massage, and not everyone has a chest which makes cardiac massage easy, and not everyone has enough broken ribs to make cardiac massage very effective.
And I guess that last part of what you're just saying there kind of brings me to the larger point, which you've cited some cases there, which you think are pretty good evidence that heart massage might regenerate conscious experience inside the brain. But don't we have to deal with the entirety of the data? We say we got a pretty good database here of near-death experiences. We have to try and explain as much of that as possible. So, if you're right for 50% of the cases, and I don't think it's anywhere near that much, because I think we have other problems to overcome, like the symptoms of hypoxia, as you're kind of mentioning, should be present, and they're not present. The symptoms of when the brain is coming back online is normally a lot of confusion, maybe even amnesia. I mean, there's a lot of studies that suggest these are the normal symptoms. We don't see those. But let's say, take all that aside and even say, let's say you're right and your explanation accounts for 50% of the cases. Well, we still have a medical miracle here, even if you have only 50% of Dr. Long's 600 cases being unexplained. I guess, it seems to me like there's a lot of wiggle room in his data, and there isn't a lot of wiggle room in your explanations. Your explanations have to account for all the cases.
Actually, it does. Because what you have is a difference between the observer and the experiencer. Now, the thing is that in Dr. Long's cases and in all other studies of near-death experiences during cardiac arrest, no one has actually any electroencephalographic data. They go on presumption. Therefore, you cannot say. We do know from the cases where people did have an electroencephalograph attached that that electrical activity of the brain is restored with efficient cardiac massage. That is a fact. But then we come to the matter of the hypoxia, or the oxygen starvation of the brain, as you would like to go, as I would rather express it, because that's a more easily understood term. Now, there have been many studies of oxygen starvation, and in fact, there's a very good book written by Van Leer and Stickney in Chicago, from the Chicago University in 1963, and also the same studies, similar studies, and other ones have repeated have confirmed the same phenomena, and that is one. If you observe a person who is oxygen starved, they look confused, dazed, they don't walk properly because of, and in actual fact, it's not much. They're like these dazed mountaineers above 5,000 meters without oxygen. But the person undergoing this, they have two ways of experiencing it. Many people who undergo, and I refer to a colleague of mine, Professor Dahan, in the local University of Leiden, who does experiments with hypoxia and oxygen drive and respiratory drive. Now, he administers oxygen-starved mixtures regularly to people, and he says, yeah, they look like rubbish, but they feel like heaven. They feel fantastic, and they feel more awake, aware, and everything like that. In fact, precisely what people describe during near-death experiences due to hypoxia. But hypoxia, as I say, is not the only explanation for near-death experiences. It certainly is with cardiac arrest, but not during anesthesia, not during jumping from the Golden Gate Bridge or fear experiences.
Well, let's get into that. Let's get into anesthesia in just a minute. Before we leave this lucid experience part, and maybe we'll come back and touch on it later. You know,
I would add one thing to this lucid experience.
Yes.
It's very curious, but during extreme hypoxia or oxygen starvation of the brain, two senses are preserved. One is hearing, that remains preserved until you're unconscious, basically. So people, even though they're extremely oxygen-starved, they can hear. Second, although the sense of body position, while this is abnormal, it is, to a degree, preserved. And these are the two things. But the sensation of pain, or the sensation that pain is painful and unpleasant, is lost. And that can be explained also with the physiology of oxygen starvation of the brain. But anyway, so you shouldn't eliminate hypoxia or oxygen starvation of the brain as an explanation, because people do, and many of them do, feel fantastic during oxygen starvation of the brain. And they feel their senses are more acute, their hearing is better, and their perceptions are better, and their thoughts are more accurate and better and faster. So, in fact, that explains a great deal.
Okay, well, we still have two big problems in that time sequence, though, right? We have the problem after the 15 seconds when the brain does go flat. Or we can, you said we don't have these people hooked up to an EEG, so we don't know. But we can be pretty confident when they're having a cardiac arrest that within 20 seconds their brain is flat, whether we have them hooked up to an EEG or not. And I'd go back and say, I'm not entirely sure that in every one of these cases we don't have any EEG data, but I just don't know that, and it sounds like you're pretty confident that we don't, so I'll just leave that as an aside. But so we have these two other time frames that we have to worry about. One is when we know the brain, or we can reasonably assume that the brain is flat. And if there's any lucid experience during that time, we don't have any way of accounting for it. And then the third part is when the brain is coming back online. And as you just mentioned, we do have these other problems of confusion and pain and these other symptoms that are normally reported that aren't present at all in the data that we're working with in terms of Dr. Long. So we do need some kind of explanation to jive those two together, don't we?
Not not really. The thing is that, one, with this business of cardiac arrest, there are near-death experiences where people describe themselves, boom, cardiac arrest, and they hear people saying around them saying, oh, he's fallen down, oh, cardiac arrest, etc., and they hear people running towards them. Then, what most people describe is they describe themselves as looking down upon their bodies as their doctors are working upon them. In other words, they are actually undergoing cardiac massage at the time.
Okay, but let me just interject. So what if their experience includes a period of looking down at their body before they have cardiac massage, before they have defibrillation, before that? What about when they have that experience?
I have never come across actually a person or a near-death experience of a person who actually had a documented cardiac arrest, and in between, one, they feeling themselves fading away, but they had an out-of-body experience or another experience where they saw nothing happening, but just their body lying there.
No, there's plenty of those in Dr. Long's database. I mean, all the accounts are there online. Anyone can read it, but there's plenty of folks that said, they experienced cardiac arrest and then they just saw their body flat, or they saw the line go flat on the EKG machine for an extended period of time, and then they saw them scrambling. They'll say the whole thing. They saw everyone scrambling around in the thing and they didn't know what to do, and there was some confusion, and they wheeled in one cart and then they wheeled that out and then they had to wheel another one, and then so that go through the whole thing.
No doubt about that. The thing is that what he is describing is time dilation, which is something which can actually happen. And second, the fact that a person does not move during oxygen starvation does not automatically mean that they are unconscious. In fact, several studies have shown that during extreme, and also case reports during extreme hypoxia, just before a person loses consciousness due to oxygen starvation, they are paralyzed due to oxygen starvation, a similar phenomenon very similar to the locked-in syndrome, and I think the mechanism is more or less the same. They are paralyzed but conscious. Okay, so in that case, you don't need many seconds to have an experience.
But let's be clear, just so we're talking about the same thing. Your explanation has to fit in every case. And if we limit it to just talking about cardiac arrest because it's easier, then your explanation has to fit every cardiac arrest incident when we know, again, that there's no medical explanation for them having any conscious experience beyond 15 seconds, right? So isn't there a problem that they all the cases have to match up to your explanation?
Not at all. I don't see any problem at all. And in fact, I'm sure a good analysis will actually show this very point. The second thing is that not everyone of these people who have a cardiac arrest has actually no cardiac output at the time. I have actually seen people during ventricular tachycardia which is another abnormal heart rhythm, who actually have a reasonable blood pressure and everything else. So, and also the anecdotes that you have, or these stories, they do not entirely convince. And in fact, they don't convince at all, because some people may well have had a low cardiac output and they see people rushing to them. And they see, something on their monitor, but when did they see this? So I think my explanation accounts for most of it.
Okay. Well, let's move on, because we have a lot of ground to cover, and it's already very, very fascinating, and I like the way you come at these topics. It's very straightforward and with very solid kind of medical understanding of it. I think that really helps contribute to this whole discussion and this dialogue so that folks can figure this stuff out. So with that, let's go on to point 2, which is the out-of-body experience. NDErs see and hear the out-of-body state, and what they perceive is nearly always real. Okay, that's Dr. Long's assertion. Why don't you go ahead and tell us your response to that?
No, it's a nice question, actually. And in fact, it's a fascinating experience. It's also a real experience. There's no doubt about it. People really do feel themselves dissociated from their body, and they do really perceive themselves as looking down upon their body, etc. So there's no doubt about it. There's a real experience. In fact, what is very curious is when you look at it, these studies, many of these reports of out-of-body experiences during cardiac arrest or other medical emergencies or whatever, they usually describe themselves as either floating above or standing at the same level as their body, and usually at a, separated by a distance of around 2-3 meters, something like that. In other words, 6 to 10 feet, something like that. Then this is actually precisely what you would expect from most people with autoscopic experiences, as described by in an old article, even in the 50s, 1957, if I remember, from a certain Dr. Lukianowicz. And but anyway, that's a nice thing. And he was talking about doppelgangers and other things. But anyway, then we're talking about these out-of-body experiences. What is very curious, and that's my big problem with this, is that many people describing their out-of-body experiences describe what they hear and what they see. This is amazing, because when you're talking about an out-of-body experiences or a possible separated consciousness, a consciousness separate from the body and distant from the body, you're talking about something which is immaterial. In other words, this separated consciousness can pass through doors, can pass through walls, can even move out of the body without any sort of interaction with the material matter of the body. Yet, this separated consciousness can somehow hear sound waves. Sound waves, basically pressure waves in air, which is very material. Yet the same separated consciousness did not interact with any solid material like the body as it left, or operating theater drapes, as in the case of Pam Reynolds and other people who have out-of-body experiences during surgery. And it can also see things. And it doesn't just see things, it sees things with light. Why do I say? And light is just basically another form of electromagnetic radiation, and it's the same sort of forces that bind molecules together, etc. And yet, moving out of the body, no interaction with these electromagnetic forces. Yet, it sees colors with light, and sees colors of clothing, it sees people, and the combination of these sounds and this hearing and this sight make up the the verifiable out-of-body experience reports. They hear people who are actually present at the time. They hear these people. They report also, yes, these things were said at the time. These things were seen at the time. These people wore this type of clothing. Yes, these people were there.
So what's your explanation then? Go ahead. I hear what you're saying. So your explanation for the OBE experience, collecting this data is?
Well, what you have actually is these people who observe, they see with light and they hear with sound. Otherwise, it wouldn't be verifiable. So in other words, what you actually have is these people, the separated, who are undergoing out-of-body experience, their separated consciousness is actually somehow interacting with light and sound, whereas before, it did not at all.
But Dr. Woerlee, isn't there a certain degree of kind of circular reasoning there? If we start with the assumption that we say, you can't hear and you can't see without your brain and without interacting with the material world, and then we say, okay, so then we can assume that any account that describes hearing or seeing without the brain being present, therefore we should dismiss that account. I mean, how would we ever get out of that loop if we start with the presupposing that there isn't any possible way that the OBE can really be seeing and hearing?
Well, there is one very simple way, and that is that the out-of-body experiencer is actually seeing and hearing with their body. They are hearing with their ears, and that means they can hear the sound. And they see with either their eyes in some cases, because their eyes are open, and so they can actually see people around them. And second, when you close your eyes, you can actually visualize, in your mind's eye, as it were, quite a lot of what is actually happening around you.
But again, to me, that doesn't fit the data. I mean, it's an explanation out there, but when then we try and match it up with the data, it doesn't fit. And what I think the OBEers would immediately point out is that the biggest way it doesn't fit the data is that they're often bringing in data that they couldn't possibly see right inside the immediate vicinity of down the hall of the hospital or on a different floor or miles away.
You're confusing two types of out-of-body experiences. One type of out-of-body experience in the vicinity of the person, and a second separated by a long distance from a person. To begin with, in the region of the person themselves, in their immediate vicinity, physical hearing and physical seeing, as well as building up an image in the mind's eye, will explain most of it. In fact, there's a very good near the out-of-body experience report by Dr. Pim van Lommel in his article in The Lancet, and in which he describes a man who fell down in a field near Nijmegen, which is in east of Holland, and was collected by the ambulance, brought back to the hospital, resuscitated. And during his resuscitation, he heard these people speaking and saying, shall we continue or not? And he tried telling them, I'm alive, I'm alive. No one heard him, of course. And keep on going. No one heard him. But what he described was, he saw himself lying there. He saw these people resuscitating him. He could describe then a number of women and a number of men. And what he also described was, he described hearing, seeing, and also the pain of the resuscitation, because he was placed underneath a apparatus that's called a thumper. It's made by Michigan Instruments, and what that does is a sort of pneumatic ram, which does heart massage without any people being needed. It just is a sort of piston which bangs up and down, doing heart massage. And he described the pain from this. In other words, what this fellow was describing is actually hearing with his ears, because he could feel the pain of the heart massage continuing at the same time. This is one of the unusual reports. So for people in the vicinity, or in the immediate vicinity of a person undergoing heart massage for cardiac arrest or an out-of-body experience due to anything else, hearing and seeing and building up an image in the mind's eye of the person will describe this. As to distant out-of-body experiences where they make observations at a distance, there are anecdotal stories of these reports actually describing the reality at the time and what was seen and what was heard. However, when you examine these very carefully and actually look at the evidence piece by piece, you find that there are many inaccuracies, and in fact it does not always correspond all that well. It's a bit like people in the book of Jeffrey Long, where they meet deceased relatives, and they haven't recognized them, they don't know who these relatives are, so they go, when they arouse from their near-death experience, they go to old family photo albums, and they look through, and they say, hey, that's Aunt Tilly, or that's Uncle Bob. I remember seeing him there. It's a bit like that.
Let's get into that later, because I think the family reunion, if we have time for it, is an interesting topic to bring up. I'd push back on a couple of points there about the OBE experience. One is your distinction between the near vicinity OBEs and the distant OBEs is a distinction that you're making. I don't know that Dr. Long makes that or that his research suggests any distinction. As a matter of fact, I think just the opposite. He doesn't see any difference in the accuracy of the data that comes back between the data that's from the vicinity and the data that's far away. Again, that's suggestive, I think, of his point. And also, even the data that's collected within the vicinity of the person who is dead at the time or unconscious at the time includes information that wouldn't normally be perceived by the senses. So again, I think what we really have to do, it demands that we really match the data that's been collected in this database that we both think is pretty strong, and we match the data statistically with what we would expect to find if your case is really true. And I don't think it is. And I guess I'd make one other point that I guess highlights that, and that's, you know, the whole process of CPR. I mean, if you look at folks who have had a near-death experience and remember something about the resuscitation process, and we'll leave aside whether that's because of, you know, increased blood flow to the brain or whatever. You had an NDE and you remember your resuscitation. The perspective that they remember it from is being out of their body. Now, if you go and ask people who are resuscitated, remember their resuscitation, didn't have an NDE, their perspective is not from an out-of-body experience. And so we wouldn't expect that. We wouldn't expect that there's this huge difference between people that experience this out-of-body experience, and it's directly related to whether they had an NDE.
Actually, it's a good question, and it's a very good point. What you actually are saying is that the out-of-body experience or near-death experience during a cardiac resuscitation is something unusual. And in fact, that is true. It only occurs in around 10% or even less of people who actually have a real, as defined by the criteria of Ring or Grayson, who have a real near-death experience, as defined by them. That's an unusual thing. And you've always got to consider with this type of thing that any medical disorder, be it infectious or a circulatory arrest such as that, you have a standard set of manifestations, symptoms, experiences, and then you have a more unusual subset. And there's an old medical dictum or adage which says uncommon manifestations of common disorders occur far more frequently and are far more likely than common manifestations of uncommon disorders. And what you actually are describing here is something very similar to that. What you actually have is an unusual subset, but one which is also due to the same phenomenon of the cardiac arrest or other disorders. And in fact, this is what you have with near-death experiences during cardiac arrest. And in fact, the business of the out-of-body experience during these cardiac arrests is actually a problem of proprioception, because at the same time you have abnormal function of the parietal lobe, abnormal function of whole areas of the brain, which induce actually all the symptoms of the person who describes a cardiac arrest.
That's an interesting point, and you brought it up in your critique that's online that we've linked to from the website. But I think there's something missing there. I mean, don't we have to show that there's some correlation there? If we take the whole population of people who have cardiac arrest, and then we say 10 to 15% of them have a near-death experience, and then we say, hey, you know what? Oh, by the way, 10 to 15% of them also have this increased blood flow to the brain. Well, those don't necessarily overlap 100%. We would have to somehow do some kind of study to show that there's some correlation just because the numbers are the same. And don't we have the same problem here? I mean, to assume that everyone who's being resuscitated is because they had the out-of-body experience must mean that they have some other set of physiological symptoms going on. Well, we don't have any evidence for that, do we?
Now, the problem is that there is very little, there are actually surprisingly few studies made of the flow of blood within the brain of a person undergoing cardiac massage for a cardiac arrest. And for obvious reasons, this is not done experimentally. Inducing a cardiac arrest just to investigate this is not actually done experimentally. So in fact, most people, when they have a cardiac arrest, do that in all sorts of places where it is inconvenient to attach monitoring. And this is the big problem. The few places, situations where people have cardiac arrest and where monitoring was applied, they're not that common. So that's a big thing. Now, when you look at the studies of people undergoing cardiac arrest, for instance, I refer again to the good study of Pim van Lommel, and he finds actually that when you look at these studies, you find that only 24%, 1/4 of the people who underwent a near-death experience, as defined as a near-death experience, during a cardiac arrest actually had an out-of-body experience. The other 3/4 did not.
Right, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything. We can't really conclude much from that, can we?
No, but what I mean with this is very simply, what you have is that with a cardiac arrest and a near-death experience, the near-death experiences of these people undergoing cardiac arrests are not identical. Some will have, most will have a feeling of awareness of being dead, or of ecstasy, or serenity, etc. But only 1/4 will actually have an out-of-body experience. Only 1/4 will experience a tunnel. 1/4 will have a light experience. They don't always all overlap. So it is not a unitary experience.
Well, but I think that's what the study that Dr. Long has kind of fleshes out in a really significant way. I mean, we can tear that data apart a million different ways, and he has. I mean, the tunnel part he excludes because they've just found over time that isn't really a meaningful measure, but there's a bunch of other ones. I'll tell you what, I'm going to run out of your time here, and I want to use it as wisely as I can. So I'm going to push on to these other topics, and particularly want to get into anesthesia, which is your specialty, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But before we get there, let's touch on blind sight, because it's obviously something very dramatic, and that when we hear it in the media, it seems like a very profound, unexplainable, medically kind of thing, and let's hear your explanation for it. So blind sight, NDEs take place among those that are blind, and these NDEs often include visual experiences. Your response to that?
That's also a fascinating phenomenon. I've read the book of Mindsight very carefully. It's a fascinating book written by Kenneth Ring, a well-known near-death researcher, together with another female researcher, Sharon. I forget her surname. It's an interesting book, fascinating even. It reveals that people who are blind, and supposedly blind from birth as well, can actually have clear and even what appear to be visual near-death experiences. Now, I've looked through the book carefully. What he actually shows is something very fascinating. If you look carefully at the stories of these people, I've cited a number of them on the critique of the book of Jeffrey Long, you find that many of them were actually not totally blind. They can see light, and some of them became blind. And even those who were blind from birth, they could distinguish between light and dark. And then we come to the matter of the experiences themselves. These are very clear experiences where they make good descriptions. But actually, what he doesn't actually prove is that this is true sight. Many blind people make extremely good mental maps of their surroundings. And this has been shown time and again in many psychological studies of blind people. And what is even more surprising is blind people can even make very good drawings of as if they are sighted, some of them. Some of them can even make good sculptures, very visual things. Thirdly, they can navigate through buildings quite accurately, even unknown places. So, in fact, they're very good at building mental maps and imagery, not quite the same as sight, but in the way they see things. So what they actually may be describing, and that doesn't really come out in that book of Ring and Sharon, what they may be describing is actually the way they see things rather than you or I see things. Another point is that they are inundated with visual imagery. So many of these things that they see or visualize in their mind's eye, as it were, are actually described in terms of color, because that's what they're used to. They hear it on the television, the radio, from other people. So you don't actually need to postulate that they actually see things in the same way. Another point with this book is a case where they describe a man who had been blind for 40 years, and he described the tie of someone else. Well, the thing is that this could not be verified at the time, because the person who was present at the time of the incident actually did not remember anything about it. So it's a book which raises questions, but does not answer any of them.
And this is a fascinating topic, and I think you're right to point out that we need to break this into two groups. One, people who were sighted at some point in their life and then became blind, and people who are blind from birth. But I have to kind of take issue with a couple of your points. Even if we accept at face value what you're saying, that some folks who are blind are better than sighted people at being able to form an image of a room or a mental map of things without using their sight, that still doesn't explain why they would present accounts that are just as accurate as sighted people. It just doesn't. We wouldn't expect, even with their attuned faculties of hearing and touch, to be able to describe a room the same way a sighted person was. And the second point that you made, I really would take issue with. I'm not aware of, and maybe you can point me to any study that suggests that the imagery and the language that a blind person would use in describing a room would be rich with color and visual descriptions. I don't think that would be the case at all. So it really deals with the folks who were sighted at some point in their life, but we have a much bigger problem to overcome when we talk about people who've never seen and have never experienced vision at any point in their life, because as we know in the studies that have been done of these folks, they don't even have a vocabulary or a means of talking about red or blue or yellow, because it's not within their experience at all. So I don't know. I think there's a huge burden to overcome in terms of explaining these many cases of folks who are blind and yet have visual experiences during an NDE.
No, it's a good point that you make, but there are actually several problems with that. One, these people are inundated with talk of color, and often when in a room they hear people describing the colors of the walls, the furniture, the clothing, etc. So you cannot actually exclude from these reports of people who are making these near-death experience reports of contamination of their imagery with what they heard beforehand or during the experience themselves. Second, the book of Ring and Sharon is basically the only one I know of which actually describes near-death experiences among people who were blind or at birth and who were subsequently blinded. Thirdly, another matter with this book is there are some things which are very disputable or debatable therein, in that book. For instance, there is an interesting insert just before the last chapter where they say the person who reported these experiences was later found to have fabricated the whole story. But that's in a later edition of the book, the one I got when I ordered it from Amazon. So the thing is, I consider it a fascinating book, and he does raise some very interesting points, but he proves nothing.
Let's move on to the next point, your area of expertise in possibly conscious. This is Dr. Long. NDEs occur during general anesthesia when no form of consciousness should be taking place.
Unfortunately, his opinion on this matter is very different to that of all anesthesiology societies throughout the world. Even the American Society of Anesthesiology recognizes that about 1 in 1,000 to 1 in 2,000 people under modern general anesthetic techniques can be conscious and are conscious. And in fact, there's a big problem which has been recognized since the 60s by all members of all societies of anesthesia. How do you tell whether a person is unconscious? There are several signs: increased pulse rate, increased blood pressure, sweating, pupil dilation. These days you've got electrical monitoring apparatus such as the BIS, the bispectral apparatus from Advent Systems in France, which is a sort of integrated EEG. You can do brainstem evoked responses, like with clicking in ears, as was done with the Spam Reynolds case, a primitive version at that time, and EEG monitoring, electroencephalographic monitoring, which tells you nothing, and such like. And in fact, these are very good monitors most of the time, but they are not 100% accurate. In fact, the American Society of Anesthesiology, along with many others, have provided a practice advisory for the use of electrical monitoring apparatus, which states, don't trust them 100%. Use your common sense and also other clinical science together with these monitors, because sometimes they may indicate that a person is asleep even when they are not. And in fact, I've had this experience several times in my career, where, for example, a muscle paralysis monitor told me a person was paralyzed and they stood up. No, that's embarrassing, but it does happen.
Yeah. On one point I have to interject here is I don't see a huge gap between what you're saying here and what Dr. Long is saying. I mean, you're both saying that anesthesia awareness is very rare. I mean, he acknowledges that it happens, and I think he quotes the exact same stats that you do, 1 in 10,000 to 1 in 1,000 people are experiencing it. So the question would be, why would we assume that it's any more common than that among NDEers?
No, it's not any more common than that. In fact, a near-death experience during anesthesia or an out-of-body experience during anesthesia, both of these are extremely rare occurrences. Several have been reported in 1975 in a study of the effects of muscle paralysis. Others have been reported since that time. They're unusual experiences. And in fact, some people during anesthesia are very aware and very awake. And even though they appear unconscious. I've had this happen a number of times. Luckily, they didn't feel any pain, but it is very upsetting when you hear that. But these people, during apparent unconsciousness, during anesthesia, where they don't look like they're conscious or don't give any manifestations, yet are conscious, what you do notice is the fact that they are affected by the drugs used during anesthesia. The same happens as well. A classic case is, as I cite, is Pam Reynolds' case, where before she was actually connected to any sort of bypass, she actually had heard the cardiothoracic surgeon talking about the fact that the arteries in her right groin were too small for the cardiac bypass tubing. Now, this was a conversation heard by other people in the room, therefore it was verifiable. Second, at the time, she felt no pain. Well, that's the effect of the fentanyl or morphine-like drugs they use to kill pain at the time. Thirdly, she felt calm and a bit unconcerned about all this. Okay, that's also an effect of opiates. Fourthly, she thought she knew beforehand she should have told the cardiothoracic surgeon about the size of her, the artery in her right groin being too small for the tubing. Strange. I don't know the size of my arteries either. But anyway, aside from that, what you see in this...
Just let's point out here that this Pam Reynolds case isn't a part of Dr. Long's research, right?
Oh, I know, but what he does report is that many people have a clear consciousness.
But again, I just want to bring you back to this one point, and then I want you to go on and please finish. But so I think he has 23 cases of people under general anesthesia that have an NDE. If the odds are 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 10,000 that someone would have anesthesia awareness, then of those 23 cases, it would be, chances are less than one of them was experiencing anesthesia awareness. Why would we assume that a large percentage of those folks are aware under general anesthesia?
No, a large proportion of people are not aware during anesthesia. In fact, what happens is that even if people are aware during anesthesia, they often forget it at the end.
I'm sorry, but it seems like that's the assumption you're making. You're assuming that the 23 people reported in Dr. Long's study who were under general anesthesia were all somehow aware. We're experiencing this problem that anesthesiologists have of anesthesia awareness. I mean, if half of those people, so again, the odds are 1 in 10,000, but let's say in this case, by some fluke that we don't understand, 50% of them were aware. Well, then we still have 50% of them, a dozen people that we don't have that explanation for.
Well, the thing is, I don't agree with you on that point. The thing is, what he describes are experiences, unusual near-death experiences of people who were under general anesthesia at the time. In other words, these people, and it's a very rare experience, I quite agree, these people had an experience. And during this experience, they either had an out-of-body experience or they felt that their mental activity was clearer and more rapid than normal, or they felt ecstatic, etc. And now, these experiences or these effects can also be described by the effects of the drugs used during anesthesia. So I see no real problem with people having near-death experiences during anesthesia.
I was just going to interject here, and I want to get your response to this, but the tiny bit of knowledge that I have on this from a cursory examination says that that the symptoms of anesthesia awareness are not present in Dr. Long's accounts. I mean, the confusion, even the euphoria in the hallucination. Again, what he found is that the accounts are very, very accurate, are not hallucinations in the way that we normally think about them. So don't we have to factor in the normal symptoms of anesthesia awareness?
In fact, anesthesia awareness takes a number of forms. There are many people who are aware during anesthesia who actually have clear consciousness, and even what they would describe as improved consciousness. There is no problem there at all. In fact, these near-death experiences, they are actually expressing the effects of some of the effects of the anesthetic drugs, in particular the opiates, etc., and also the low doses, perhaps of benzodiazepines. There's no problem there at all. In fact, not everyone during an awareness during anesthesia has a befuddled consciousness. They don't. I've had several people who were very aware during consciousness under anesthesia. They're administered by me. Even one person who had an out-of-body experience, during which she clearly could describe the situation of the operating theater as she stood at the end of the operating table viewing everything as it happened during the nose operation. She had clear consciousness and an out-of-body experience. Second, several patients have described, another patient also described an out-of-body experience to me at the beginning of a gynecological operation. She was so-called asleep. She was standing next to the table, legs in the holders, and the gynecologist asked the anesthetist, "Can I begin?" And he said, "Yep." And she said, No, I'm not awake, I'm not asleep," and stood there next to it herself. So, in fact, these are effects of anesthetic drugs. And when you look at the effects of anesthetic drugs at several people, and I've administered anesthesia, many thousands of people, you can distinguish two types of people. One, those who find the effects of these drugs very pleasant and feel, yeah, wow, this is cool. And others who say, ugh, I don't feel so good. And so you've got a spectrum of reaction to these drugs. So, in fact, that some people have ecstatic experiences. They feel that their mental activity is faster than normal or just as good as normal. This does not surprise me one bit. I have seen these happen among people who are aware without any near-death experiences or out-of-body experiences. I've heard it from the people themselves. So that's not a big problem. In fact, that explains many of the mental states experienced by Dr. Long's patients. What he does describe in his book is that with his 23 patients, he compared them to the other 600 and whatever, and did a chi-squared analysis, as he proudly describes, and found the only difference between their experiences and that of the other people was that they experienced more darkness. Well, I can explain that too. That's in fact the physiology of the eye and a few other things. So there's no problem there. As I say, this brings us back to the point I made in the beginning, that the near-death experience can be considered a final common pathway. That means you have one experience. I often compare it to a headache. You got pain in your head. That can happen because you got a cancer in your head eating it out, or you got an abscess, a big a sac filled with pus in your head and it's all inflamed and you got a headache, or you got a big hole in your head because someone hit you with a rock, or you've got a migraine. Whatever the cause is, you have one thing, pain in your head, but the cause is different. So in other words, it's a bit like a near-death experience. You got near-death experience due to anesthesia, due to drugs, due to cardiac arrest, due to any one of a number of things. The final result is this experience.
Gee, that's interesting, because I think what Dr. Long was attempting to do by comparing the 23 cases that were under general anesthesia with the rest of the population was to say, not that here are the minor differences, but to say that there aren't many differences. So I think his point would be, we would expect that someone under general anesthesia, whether there's this awareness or not, they're heavily sedated, all these chemicals are coursing through their veins, we'd expect a different kind of conscious experience. We'd expect a reduced conscious experience, and we don't see it.
That's what he expects. But the thing is that he is not an anesthesiologist, and the experience of many anesthetists is that some people under anesthesia, if they have an awareness, is that they are fully aware and well able to describe everything and to have a clear consciousness. I've heard it once from a fellow who underwent a total extraction of all his teeth prior to undergoing heart surgery because he had rotten teeth, so that he got rid of the bacteria, a source of bacteria which would infect his new heart valve before he underwent the operation. He underwent the operation, was perfectly normal during anesthesia, no problems, And at the end of the operation, when he woke up, he described, I was awake during the operation, heard everything clearly, felt good, didn't feel any pain, felt wonderful.
Okay, well, we'll leave that alone just in the interest of time for a minute, and especially since you're the expert on anesthesia. But I wanted to hit on a topic that we touched on just earlier, just very briefly, and that's this idea of the family reunion. And Dr. Long's point is that virtually all beings encountered during NDEs are deceased at the time of the NDE, and most are deceased relatives. And your response to that was, quoting from your paper, again, these meetings are either memories of the deceased or hallucinations. In any case, no one expects to meet living relatives after death, which is why they're absent in these stories. Now here, let me bring you to I'm going to try and make this go a little bit quicker by bringing you to the point. I think there's a bunch of assumptions wrapped in there, and I don't think the assumptions match up with the data. I mean, his data is that 95% of the folks that people encounter during a near-death experience are deceased friends or relatives. Why would we expect a hallucination to conform so closely to these kind of criteria? I mean, I fail to see how we could offer up some kind of physiological explanation for that.
No, you don't need to offer a physiological explanation because people have these visions of deceased relatives. Sometimes they do not know them and later see them in these family photos. Leave that aside for the moment. But a person who expects to undergo a near-death experience, because there was a very interesting paper published by Grayson in 1985 in which he compared expected near-death experiences with unexpected. And what he found with the expected near-death experiences was that about a half of these people had what you would call transcendental experiences. In other words, they meet deceased relatives, etc. Now, what they do is that they meet these deceased relatives very well, and they only meet deceased ones because in the land of the dead, they don't expect to see any living person. This is a cultural thing and something purely common sense. These people expect to meet their relatives in an afterlife. And so, of course, they do. And the form they see their relatives in is usually in a much improved form to what they were like when they actually had passed away. You wouldn't want to imagine that you went to heaven with both legs amputated and walk around and roll around in a wheelchair. So they see their relatives improved and they look good, and these relatives come to guide them. In fact, there's cross-cultural studies reveal that, in fact, Americans tend to see relatives. People in other countries don't always see relatives.
Okay, then that brings up another point we can move on to. Again, because I think it's the same point I'm going to bring up when we talk about the cultural differences and the age differences. And just let me hit the high points, and that's that I don't think we can really expect, as you're suggesting, that these hallucinatory experiences would conform so closely to each other. You just mentioned the cultural differences. Again, he doesn't find cultural differences. The 95% of deceased friends and relatives that he finds crosses all cultures. It also crosses all age barriers. So even children as young as 3 who haven't been indoctrinated with this whole scenario of what's going to happen after you die, they're included in the data and they still see the same hallucination. I mean, isn't it kind of like you're suggesting that since we all have a similar brain, we all have similar brain physiology, and we all dream, therefore we all dream the same dream, and we know we don't dream the same dream?
That's quite correct, we don't. But the thing is that when you're talking about children of 3 and 5, etc., there is always no one has actually seen the visions that they saw during their near-death experiences, and these children also do undergo near-death experiences as well. There is no doubt about that. Melvin Morse has done a whole pile of studies on this matter and has proven it beyond any doubt. Children do undergo these things. But the thing is, as with the adults, the observers, or the people who hear these reports, do not see these visions. And if a child reports seeing a person, they give a description of it, which is vague, and then expectation comes in to the hearers as well. So you cannot prove that they see the same relatives or the same types of relatives as an adult. An adult can express themselves better, but then there comes also a matter of expectation as well, and a bit of joining up the dots, as it were, in the case of the relatives they didn't recognize during their near-death experiences. In fact, children do see deceased persons, or persons they do assume are deceased during their near-death experiences, even for the children of 3 and 5. But it does not automatically follow that the persons they say they saw are the ones they actually saw. I disagree with that.
Okay. Well, then let's hit the last point of our 9 points, and then hopefully we can wrap this up and leave a little bit room to talk at the end. And that's the final point in Dr. Long's book is this changed lives. NDEers are transformed in many ways by their experience, and they're often transformed for life.
I think it's an interesting point as well. In fact, you can explain it very mechanistically as well as psychologically. In a number of ways. One, extreme hypoxia or oxygen starvation does cause lasting changes in brain structure and function. For example, the pyramidal cells in the cerebellum, large cells in the CA1 sector of the hippocampus, or the Summers sector, whatever you like to call it, the large cells in the dorsomedial nucleus of the thalamus. These are very sensitive to the effects of hypoxia or oxygen starvation. In fact, during oxygen starvation, you notice in the frontal lobe, the EEG, or the electroencephalograph of the frontal lobes, suddenly develop delta activity, which is an indication that the thalamic, the brain circuits between the part of the brain called the thalamus and the frontal lobes no longer functions. There are many indications like this, and studies of people subjected to hypoxia, like mountaineers who climb above 5,000 meters without supplemental oxygen. They have brain function changes and mental changes and personality changes which last for 3 months to a year and even more. That's one aspect of the explanation. And 90% of all people undergoing an experience where they are nearly dead, epidemiological studies done by the World Health Organization show that 90% of them suffer oxygen starvation as a cause of their near-death experience. Okay, that's one explanation. The second is these experiences are so profound and so emotionally loaded for the people who undergo them, and even as some people say, spiritual. Okay, I'm actually a devout humanist rather than a person who a believer. These people are such profound experiences that they do have an effect upon their lives. These people have almost died. They know this, and they have undergone an amazing, a wonderful experience. Even supernatural, according to however they like to view this. And a profound experience like this does not depart and does have an effect upon people. For instance, major injuries, etc., or major life events, for instance, they do cause what is called a post-traumatic stress syndrome. And I'm not saying these people have a post-traumatic stress syndrome, but they do affect a significant proportion of these people. They make them reflect upon their lives. They make them think about how they have acted. And so they do cause changes. But these are changes either psychological changes due to reflection and thinking about what has happened to them, or a sort of post-traumatic stress disorder. And I'm not saying they have post-traumatic stress disorder. That's something quite different to what these people experience. But they have a psychological change to this. And secondly, there is the matter of the physiological effects of the episode that caused their near-death experience. And these are also possibly present. So it does not surprise me at all that many of these people do undergo a sort of life change or a changed personality, changed attitude towards life, etc. Not at all surprising.
I hear you on that. I just disagree, and I think it's interesting because it circles us back to one of the earlier points that we talked about, and that's this gap and God of the gaps or materialism of the gaps. And it's like, here's a case where we're trying to fill in a couple of huge gaps. I think the dots that you're kind of connecting are a little bit far apart, and moreover, I think there's a real easy way to get at the answer here. I mean, people suffer cardiac arrest or a brush with death, and then studies are done of them in terms of whether their lives are transformed. And then we can add in the variable of whether or not they had a near-death experience and see if their change is more dramatic and long-lasting if they had a near-death experience or if they didn't. So we don't really need to speculate here. We can just look at those studies, and I think those studies have been done.
Yes, indeed. By Tim van Lommel, by Grayson, and in fact, they more or less support this as well. In fact, the near-death experience is life-changing, but you don't need a supernatural explanation for it. It is a profound experience, and profound experiences do change people.
Well, we'll look up those studies because I think they're referenced, if I remember correctly, I think they're referenced in Dr. Long's book, and I think the results of those studies are that the brush with death doesn't significantly correlate with the change in life if it doesn't have the NDE, and the NDE is the deciding factor there. So anyways, that's a case where we have a gap, and I think we can fill it with the best research that we have at the time rather than speculation about, what might be the psychological causes for people doing or not doing things.
I agree. But all the same, the near-death experience is such a profound experience that when you throw that on top of a cardiac arrest or another acute and very severe and possibly even life-threatening illness, you do have an effect upon the person. And I agree with that entirely. I think that is reasonable and to be expected.
Well, Dr. Woerlee, you've done a terrific job for us of kind of addressing every one of these points. How would you sum up your case for a biological explanation for near-death experience?
I would like to sum it up in two things. One, my opinions on the book of Dr. Long, that I'm rather disappointed in it because it does not advance the near-death experience research any further than it was 30 years ago, which is a shame. And because there has been a lot of research done on it, it doesn't advance it. I and several others have tried to find and formulate physiological explanations for all this. And in fact, there has been a lot of research done to explain various aspects of the near-death experience itself. Ultimately, when you look at the total body of evidence explaining the physiological or biological basis of the near-death experience, the out-of-body experience, and the other experiences reported by those undergoing near-death experiences, you come to the conclusion that most of them, in fact all of them, can be explained by body function and the changes in body function induced by the various, I call them stressors, or causes of the near-death experience: hypoxia, drugs, anxiety, and go on and on. And because, as I say, the near-death experience is not a unitary experience, or the cause is not unitary. And so, in my opinion, these experiences have been explained to be biological in basis, have a biological basis, and I do not think that Dr. Long or the Long's explanation or those of others who think that there is a more supernatural explanation, that they actually correspond with the facts. Why look for a supernatural explanation when a provable biological explanation is available? In fact, there are many things which can be done to demonstrate this. And in fact, unfortunately, many people performing near-death experience studies do not actually perform adequate statistical analyses to differentiate between the causes. I would like to see more of that. But anyway, as I say, the cause, in my opinion, is biological rather than supernatural.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you very much for joining me. And more importantly, I hope that we can count on you to continue to engage in this dialogue, because what I've found is that it really takes a couple of rounds of going back and forth. One thing I'd like to do is go back and share with Dr. Long some of the details of your critique and hear his response, and then either by email or if you have the time, we'll try and connect with you again and see if we can really generate a full give and take on this topic.
I'd very much like to do that. And that sounds fascinating. And in fact, I'm sure that with a good deal of discussion and also exchange of information, more light can actually be shed upon this fascinating human experience.
Fantastic. Thanks again.
And thank you. I'm glad to have been here.
Thanks again to Dr. Woerlee for joining me today on Skeptiko. As I mentioned earlier, Dr. Long has agreed to come back on and respond to some of these points, so I'm really looking forward to having this give and take exchange. I also think there's a couple of issues that I'd like to raise with some other medical experts, so I may be pursuing that in the future as well. In the meantime, if you'd like more information about this show, including a couple of the links that we talked about, including Dr. Woerlee's book that you can download and read for free, please visit the Skeptiko website. That's at skeptiko.com. You'll also find links to all our previous shows, Facebook, email links to me, a link to our forum discussion, and a bunch of other stuff. So that's going to do it for today. Much to come on future episodes of Skeptiko. Until then, bye for now.
On this episode of Skeptiko, Dr. Jeffrey Long responds to criticisms of evidence of the afterlife.
When you talk to the patients that have actually survived CPR, one thing that is very, very obvious is that the substantial majority of them are actually confused or amnesic. If you read even a few near-death experiences, immediately you realize that there's essentially none of them that talk about confusional episodes or, altered mental status where they just don't understand what's going on. In fact, in the survey we did, we found 76% of people having a near-death experience said their level of consciousness and alertness during the NDE was actually greater than their earthly everyday life. But also, in addition to that, note that the substantial majority of people that have a near-death experience associated with cardiac arrest are actually seeing their physical body well prior to the time that CPR is initiated. And once CPR is initiated, you don't see any alteration in the flow of the near-death experience, suggesting that whatever blood flow might be going back to their brain is affecting the content, modifying it at all in any way. I'll tell you another thing, too. If you were doing CPR and that were accounting for memory, I would tell you what you would hear a lot more from near-death experiencers. They would talk about their remembrance of the pain of the chest compressions. Alex, that's a fairly painful procedure. It often breaks ribs and hurts. And yet, even when you have a patient who had a cardiac arrest and had a near-death experience, essentially never do you hear them describing as part of their near-death experience the pain of chest compressions. Again, the evidence just simply does not support Dr. Woerlee's speculation.
Stay with us for Skeptiko.
Welcome to Skeptiko, where we explore controversial science with leading researchers, thinkers, and their critics. I'm your host, Alex Sakaris, and on this episode of Skeptiko, as promised, I have a follow-up interview with Dr. Jeffrey Long, and he's here to respond to the points raised by Dr. G.M. Woerlee in the last episode of Skeptiko regarding near-death experience and evidence for the afterlife. If you've been following along on this discussion, and even if you haven't, I think the interview is pretty self-explanatory, so let's get right to it. We're joined today by Dr. Jeffrey Long, a practicing physician. He's a radiation oncologist and a near-death experience researcher. His book, Evidence of the Afterlife, is the most comprehensive study of NDEs ever published, and it's been a huge success. Dr. Long, welcome back to Skeptiko.
Alex, it's a pleasure to be back here with Skeptiko, and we certainly got plenty to talk about today.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do. As many of the listeners know, you appeared on Skeptiko, I think it was last month, and then we invited Dr. G.M. Woerlee, an anesthesiologist from the Netherlands, and he came on to discuss his criticisms of your research conclusions and to explain why he thinks NDEs are not proof of an afterlife. So I'm very grateful that you're able to come back on and have some time to respond to Dr. Woerlee's comments.
Yeah, it's certainly my pleasure to do so.
So here's what I thought we'd do. Let's jump right into this, and here's where I'd like to start, and that is with the research, because it's a point that seems to create some confusion. And, I was watching the interview you did with Bill O'Reilly on Fox, and I thought that was a great example of where a guy, Bill O'Reilly in this case, he becomes completely sidetracked with this anecdote thing. These are just anecdotes, and we can't really trust them because they're anecdotes. So I thought you should talk a little bit about survey work in medical research, and that how when you ask one person about their NDE, you may have an anecdote, but when you compile a 150 question survey of 600 people, you have something much more than that.
Boy, you just almost answered it right there. No doubt about it. When you have an anecdote, just simply means one or a few, if you will, case studies, and you have to be very hesitant to draw conclusions about small numbers. It would be like testing a new drug on 3 patients and trying to find sweeping conclusions about its effectiveness. You really can't. You need much more data than that. And that's why the study that I presented in the book is certainly vastly beyond anecdotal evidence. We actually studied 1,300 near-death experiences. So, it's certainly not just a limited number of case reports. And you're right, our modern questionnaire is over 150 questions. So no doubt we have the depth of analysis as well. And the most of the research that's published in the book was based on surveying over 600 near-death experiencers that filled out the most recent version of the questionnaire. Well, let me start out with sort of a basic scientific overview, and that is what's real is consistently observed. So we've observed evidence of the afterlife and near-death experiences not only in the vast number of near-death experiences studied in tremendous depth in my own study, but all my major findings are corroborated by scores of prior scholarly studies. So we're way beyond what could reasonably be called anecdotal. We're really in very hardcore evidence based on my work and the work of many others.
One other point that came up, and this was in the interview that I had with Dr. Woerlee, and that, first of all, he acknowledged that your research is solid, that your database is solid, which is good to hear. But then he had one point about the survey methodology that I'd like to talk about. And he suggested that perhaps your survey is biased in favor of people who have a certain kind of NDE. Now, he articulated it a little bit differently, but can you talk about any concerns that someone might have about that your survey is biased or that you're just pulling accounts of a certain kind?
Well, actually, his actual quote, as I recall it, was referencing the fact that if people had basically non-NDE experiences or very brief experiences, that they wouldn't necessarily be in the research, and that's not true at all. What we did with our INDER study is we've studied every single person who has a near-death experience. In other words, they nearly died and they had an experience. And then in addition to that, we used the most validated research tool in near-death experience research, and that's called the NDE scale. So we analyze every single person that has such an account. And in fact, we post every single near-death experience on the website for the people that give us permission, which is over 95%. So we not only have a very valid, comprehensive look at near-death experience because of the numbers, but in addition to that, we share that with the world so everybody else can see the data set that we're seeing too.
Great. And I think I even recall you saying that you don't necessarily include all the accounts because some accounts don't qualify under the criteria that you would use for a near-death experience.
And that's a good point. We post all near-death experiences, but good gosh, we have people that have life-threatening events but no experience whatsoever, and we simply don't have the resources to post every single one of those, and I don't think that really advances our knowledge of near-death experience or anything else. Other experiences are shared are clearly dreams, after-death communications, spontaneous out-of-body experiences, meditation experiences. So all of those are most of the time they're not posted. Occasionally we do, and we label them by their proper label. But as for our study set and what's important for our focus of study is near-death experience, and we have all of our near-death experiences analyzed in our data set.
Great. So it's important then acknowledge one more time that there are these criteria that have been well established by the research that's been going on for over 20 years in near-death experience.
So it's a good point. What is and is not a near-death experience has been pretty well established over the years. My criteria for near-death experience is pretty much what everybody else is using, especially with the use of the NDE scale. So we're using the best research methodologies to determine what is and is not a near-death experience. And in fact, in the over a decade that I've been doing this, I haven't heard from a single near-death experience researcher that had concerns about the methodology we were using for what we call a near-death experience and not a near-death experience.
So next, let's talk about the 9 lines of evidence that you present in your book, Evidence of the Afterlife, and that Dr. Woerlee tried to refute when he was on. And I want to get to as many as we have time for, but before we dig into each one, I thought I might ask you about the overall gist of Dr. Woerlee's argument, because it kept coming up time and time again, and that's this kind of rare counterexample thing. So if you say, as you do, that you studied 26 cases of NDEs under general anesthesia, then he comes back and says, yeah, but every once in a while, I think it's like 1 in 10,000, people have regained some consciousness during anesthesia. And then you say, well, that's not only extremely likely, but if it did happen, then the symptoms would make it unlikely that they would have this lucid experience. And then he comes back and says, yeah, but there are some cases where people did have a lucid experience. So it just goes on and on like this and then you step back and you say, what are really the odds of this 1 out of 10,000 thing happening in every single case? And on top of that this even rarer occurrence of them not experiencing the normal symptoms. And on top of that their experiences would match up with all the people that had a different set of medical conditions. As you would normally look at this in science, at some point, doesn't it just become so enormously, the odds become enormously outrageous that you wouldn't even go there?
Well, that's a real good point. I agree with everything you said, Alex, and there's even more. In fact, if you look at the book Evidence of the Afterlife on page 103 to 104, I talk directly about this so-called anesthetic awareness that Dr. Woerlee discusses. As an overview, let me say that these anesthetic awareness experiences are so very, very rare that I hope this never dissuades anybody from having medically appropriate general anesthesia. Please don't let any of the discussion here be an issue in preventing appropriate medical care. But as I say in the book, and this is a direct quote, rather than the type of coherent NDEs you read here, anesthetic awareness results in a totally different experience. And I provide a number of references on that, by the way, for interested listeners. I go on to say those who experience anesthetic awareness often report very unpleasant, painful, and frightening experiences. Unlike NDEs, which are predominantly visual experiences, this partial awakening during anesthesia more often involves brief and fragmented experiences that may involve hearing, but usually not vision. And again, I emphasize that anesthetic awareness is very rare under anesthesia. And by the way, I'm not aware of any near-death experiences that occurred under general anesthesia on the NDERF website that describe the typical content of anesthetic awareness experiences. Dr. Woerlee brings up a few anecdotal discussions about anesthetic awareness, but I have a number of references. So these are the scholarly people that have actually studied a number of anesthetic awareness experiences and published them in peer-reviewed journals in the past. That's my source of evidence, and as all your listeners can easily see, you just don't have near-death experiences that are predominantly hearing but no vision. You don't essentially ever have near-death experiences that involve brief fragmented experiences that are painful, that are frightening. In fact, none of the general anesthesia near-death experiences that I'd reviewed had any of those components of them. So really there's no doubt about that. These are completely different experiences, that being anesthetic awareness and near-death experiences. And I don't think Dr. Woerlee quite got that point, how clear that was, how crystal clear the distinction between those two types of experiences is.
Yeah, and I guess that gets to the larger question there that I'd ask, and that's, how do you counter these arguments? How do you counter these arguments that don't really make sense, but because they come from people who should know better, and because they're said with such conviction over and over again, it doesn't match the data? Even though Dr. Woerlee was picking out anecdotes that he thought were appropriate, they still didn't even match the data, as you're saying that they didn't give us the results we would expect to find. And yet we were never able to really get there in my discussion with him. How do you engage? How do you carry out a scholarly or an intellectual discussion along those lines?
Well, first of all, I have a lot more confidence in your listeners. I think they have a lot more of a scholarly open-mindedness than your discussion with Dr. Woerlee was. So I think and I have confidence in the substantial majority of people, that being when they hear evidence and it's presented very straightforward, that they're smart enough to understand what's real evidence and what supports the evidence and what's basically evasiveness in trying to deal with a particular line of evidence. So I guess part of it is I have confidence in your listeners, I have confidence in the great majority of people that understand the issues, and I have confidence in humanity. I admit it's a little bit frustrating when people don't directly respond to the evidence. It's very carefully documented, referenced, and even corroborated with scores of prior studies. But I think the best we can do, and you've been doing this for a long time, Alex, is just simply calmly bring forward the facts, discuss exactly what the issues are, respond to any reasonable arguments that anybody brings up against the lines of evidence, and just go forward.
Well, let's touch on statistics for a minute, because this is another rat's nest that I encounter sometimes with folks who have one position or another. And sometimes people want to grab onto statistics, but other times, like in this case, they seem to want to run from them. In your normal medical research, at what point do you reach a level where you say, gee, it's overwhelmingly suggestive that this is what's happening? How do you ferret all that out?
Yeah, I think that's a lot of it's depend on the number of patients studied and how strong the statistical evidence is. At other times it's just simply obvious by inspection. For example, when we talked about near-death experiences under general anesthesia, out of 33 elements of near-death experience, we compared between NDEs under general anesthesia and all other elements. In 32 of the, all other types of causes of near-death experience, in 32 out of 33 elements studied, there was no statistical difference between the two groups. Now, virtually anybody in the science or medical field would say, wow, that pretty much nails it down that these two experiences are basically the same, with at most minor differences between the two of them. So I think that's, it just becomes, I think, a matter of a judgment call. But in fairly extreme situations where we have such strong evidence like presented in the book, Evidence of the Afterlife, I think that, you have to rely on the good judgment and intelligence of your listeners and the world as a whole. I think, and certainly from the feedback I've got from the book, the good news is virtually everybody gets the statistics in the book as exactly the evidence that they are.
Right. I agree with you. I think you have to work really, really hard to take the other position on some of those things. Like we were just talking about anesthesia, and we'll get into some of these other cases. Let's move on and touch on as many of the 9 points as we have a chance to. And of course, the first point is this lucid death. It's medically inexplicable to have a highly organized lucid experience while unconscious or clinically dead. Now, Dr. Woerlee's main point on this was blood flow to the brain, mainly caused by CPR, and that being the factor that you haven't looked at that explains why people are having these lucid experiences.
Oh, sure, absolutely. There's a huge difference between simply blood flow to the brain and consciousness, and I think that's where Dr. Woerlee's argument falls apart. Clinically, as we've learned medically, there's no substitute for talking to patients. Well, when you talk to the patients that have actually survived CPR, and one thing that is very, very obvious is that the substantial majority of them are actually confused or amnesic, even when they're successfully recovered. They may be amnesic for the period of time following their successful resuscitation or even for events prior to the time of their cardiac arrest.
Can I interject something there? Because I want to just stop you on a minor point that you just breezed over, and it's really important, and that's back to statistics. So we're saying that a vast majority of those people, so statistically the group is supposed to have this, and then we compare that to whether or not the group that you studied had that same thing, and they don't match, right?
Oh, absolutely. If you read even a few near-death experiences, immediately you realize that there's essentially none of them that talk about confusional episodes or, altered mental status where they just don't understand what's going on. So you really don't see that at all. And again, for near-death experiences, they're highly lucid, organized events. In fact, in the survey we did, we found 76% of people having a near-death experience said their level of consciousness and alertness during the NDE was actually greater greater than their earthly everyday life.
Greater. Yeah.
And so that's again, getting back to statistics, that's 3/4, and the substantial majority of the remaining 24% still had at least a level of consciousness and alertness equal to their earthly everyday life. So for that to be the statistics that you consistently see during near-death experiences and balance that with the substantial majority of people being confused around the time of their successful resuscitation from CPR, you really have to come away with the conclusion that even if there's blood flow to the brain induced by CPR as a life-saving maneuver, by no means is that correlated with clear consciousness, and certainly nowhere near the level of consciousness and alertness with near-death experiences. I mean, you just don't see that. But also, in addition to that, note that the substantial majority of people that have a near-death experience and have an out-of-body experience associated with cardiac arrest are actually seeing their physical body well prior to the time that CPR is initiated. And once CPR is initiated, you don't see any alteration in the flow of the near-death experience, suggesting that whatever blood flow might be going back to their brain is affecting the content, modifying it at all in any way.
That's a great point that I want to draw out a little bit further, because if we were to break down this process that someone's going through, there's 3 stages, right? I mean, one where the brain is going dead. They've had, let's say, a cardiac arrest, which we always talk about because we understand the physiology better than in other cases. But we know that within 10 to 15 seconds after their heart stops, their brain stops. So there's that period. Then there's some period that we have to assume that the brain is dead. And then there's some period where the brain is coming back online. And what you just said, I think, is really, really important and gets glossed over. And that's that you seem to be getting information, content from these near-death experiences that seems to be consistent during the dead time and the coming back online time, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, there's no doubt about that when there's a cardiac arrest, the out-of-body observations that are often described during these near-death experiences certainly correlates to a time prior to CPR being initiated and prior to a time there should be no possibility of a conscious, lucid, organized experience. And yet that's exactly what happens. I'll tell you another thing, too. If you were doing CPR and that were accounting for memory, I would tell you what you would hear a lot more from near-death experiencers. They would talk about their remembrance of the pain of the chest compressions. Alex, that's a fairly painful procedure. It often breaks ribs and hurts. And yet, even when you have a patient who had a cardiac arrest, had a near-death experience, essentially never do you hear them describing as part of their near-death experience the pain of chest compressions. Again, it's the evidence just simply does not support Dr. Woerlee's speculation.
No, that's a great point on the pain factor, and that rolls right into the second point of your 9 lines of evidence in evidence of the afterlife, and that's out of body, and to ear, see, and hear in the out-of-body state, and what they perceive is nearly always real. Now, the way that kind of rolls right into it is that Dr. Woerlee's speculation on the last episode of Skeptiko was that maybe these folks are just seeing and hearing things in their normal senses, in their normal body. One of the points you made is that they're not experiencing pain. That seems to be more consistent with this idea that their consciousness truly is outside of their body.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And if their consciousness were really returning during CPR, wouldn't near-death experiencers not have out-of-body perceptions, but describe their perception from within their physical body? And yet you don't see that with near-death experiences. So in other words, if you started CPR and they had a near-death experience and suddenly they started to have some consciousness, you'd expect that all of a sudden that they would start to have some instead of having the out-of-body experience where their consciousness is apart from their body, their consciousness would be within their body, and you just don't see that.
Right. So again, you have to go back to the account. So what about the point he makes about the 2 types of out-of-body experiences? And I think that's his delineation there of the out-of-body experience where someone is relatively close to their body and the ones where there is this distant gathering of information down the hallway or miles away. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's really, that's an interesting point. There's actually 2 different, if you will, if you want to, somewhat arbitrarily divide out-of-body experiences, that's one way you could do it. Certainly, most out-of-body observations during NDEs are of events going on around their physical body, and yet there are dozens of these out-of-body perceptions during near-death experiences where they can hear and see events far, far removed from their physical body, often in completely different rooms, geographically far away, where any possible physical sensory awareness should be absolutely impossible. And yet when they make these very remote out-of-body experience observations, their accuracy is absolutely the same, about 96%, as it is their own of the observations of events going on around their physical body. So no doubt about that, that's the evidence, and Dr. Woerlee can never really come up with a good explanation for that at all.
So you mentioned that distinction would be arbitrary. You're saying from the data you've seen, you don't see any reason to separate out based on the accounts, based on the information you're getting back. There's no substantial difference between people who are describing events close to them and people who are describing events further away from them.
They're both highly accurate. Any geographic distance. I mean, how far of a geographic distance that you would want apart from the body before you're going to call distant OBE observations? No one's really made that distinction in the NDE literature. So, really, the bottom line is just another strong line of evidence for the reality of OBE observations, that they're equally accurate even if these observations are far, far away from their physical body.
Okay, because he seems to be suggesting you're of a different quality, but they're not like describing things in a different way or like more hallucinatory. It's pretty much the same across the board.
Absolutely. And in fact, some people make, as often is the case, they'll make out-of-body observations of events right around their physical body during the NDE, and then as part of the same experience, make out-of-body observations far removed from their physical body. Absolutely no difference in what they're describing.
Let's talk about blind sight. This is another interesting point. In your research, you observed that NDEs take place among some folks who are blind and even folks who are blind from birth. Now, Dr. Woerlee's counterargument to that was, one, maybe these folks are getting visual information from the people around them who are describing things, but then he also seems to suggest that many blind people are extremely good at creating these mental maps of these surroundings. Now, I found that a little bit of a stretch. Do we really expect that folks who are visually impaired or completely blind from birth would be able to describe visual information as well as sighted people?
Yeah, I mean, that was puzzling to me, too, to have that line of thinking. And by the way, all of a sudden, for people blind from birth, the first time they have vision is while they're unconscious or clinically dead. I mean, it really doesn't add up. But certainly, the people that are blind may get some visual information from people around them. But when you talk to people that have been blind from birth that have a visual near-death experience, as they typically do, the near-death experiencers themselves are very clear that this vision is a unique perception to them. No matter what they've done in the past as far as mental maps or gathering visual information, whatever that means, the actual ability to see during their near-death experiences is a new experience to them. It's clearly different from anything else going on in their life.
Let's talk about a couple of other points that came up that we didn't spend as much time on, but I think are really fascinating. One is the family reunion, and your data suggests that people consistently meet loved ones in the afterlife, and that number two, I think your statistics were unbelievably high, like 98% of the folks they encounter are deceased. And I didn't really hear a good counter argument or explanation, I should say, from Dr. Woerlee on that.
Well, yeah, certainly. Let me back up and define what we're talking about. Certainly when people have a near-death experience, they may have their out-of-body observations and see ongoing earthly events. That's not what really counts in this type of a study. You have to be in an unearthly realm, and you have to be seeing people that you knew during your earthly life that are not going about their daily earthly events like in an out-of-body experience observation. So these are purely observations in unearthly realms. And you're right, the percentage of time that people encounter deceased relatives is extremely high. It was actually 96% in the INDER study, and only 4% of the NDErs met beings who were alive at the time of the near-death experience. And that's actually corroborated by another major scholarly study, which found it was 95% of the time that they encountered beings they knew from their earthly life they were deceased. Now, the important thing is that any other experience of altered consciousness that we experience on Earth, dreams, hallucination, drug experiences, you name it. And all of these other types of experiences of altered consciousness, a vastly higher percentage of people are going to be alive at the time of their experience. You're going to remember the banker that you did business with that day, or your family member you said hi to as you were walking into the house. This is what's in the forefront of consciousness. So for people to so consistently encounter deceased relatives is very, very strong evidence that they are indeed in an unearthly realm, and certainly points to evidence of an afterlife.
Any thoughts on the striking similarity of content among very young people who've experienced a near-death experience, or the remarkable consistency of NDEs around the world?
Sure. We'll start with children. Really interesting part of the study that I did was looking at children age 5 and under. In fact, their average age was 3.5 years old. These are children so young that to them, death is an abstraction. They don't understand it. They can't conceptualize it. They've almost never heard about near-death experiences, have no preconceived notions about that. They certainly have far less cultural influence, both in terms of religion or anything else that could even potentially modify the near-death experience at that tender young age. And yet, looking at these same 33 elements of near-death experience that I did in other parts of this study, I found absolutely no statistical difference in their percentage of occurrence in very young children as compared to older children and adults. So no question about that. That almost single-handedly shoots down the skeptical argument that near-death experiences are due to pre-existing beliefs or cultural influences. We're not seeing a shred of evidence that corroborates that at all. And in fact, that finding is actually corroborated with another major scholarly researcher who actually reviewed over 30 years of near-death experience research and came up with the same conclusion, that children, including very young children, appear to have identical near-death experiences as adults. So no question about that. That seems to be a fact, and that's not explainable by any medical, psychological, or expectation theory that could be advanced.
Okay, let's spend a minute then talking about point 9 on your 9 lines of evidence, and that's change lives. NDEers are transformed in many ways by their experience, often for life. And I think Dr. Woerlee suggested that a brush with death could change anyone's life, and also that just the NDE experience might change someone's life.
Yeah, there's actually been 2 good prospective studies in which there were cardiac arrest survivors. Most, of course, did not have a near-death experience, but a number did. And these researchers followed the 2 groups longitudinally over a period of many, many years. In both studies, they found that there may be some life changes in people that had a cardiac arrest, in other words, survived a life-threatening event, but there were far more life changes typical of near-death experiencers described in other research among those that actually had a near-death experience. So it certainly looks like it's the near-death experience and not just the life-threatening event that accounts for the preponderance of the changes seen after a near-death experience. So I think that's pretty well established.
Okay.
I'm glad that Dr. Woerlee agrees that the near-death experience itself can have such profound changes. Once again, I have confidence in people that they're not going to make huge, substantial life changes unless they're comfortable and clear that they're making changes in response to a real event. That's what near-death experiencers almost consistently believe, and I'm certain that's why they have such a major factor why they have such profound positive life changes.
Yeah, there did seem to be a certain degree of circular logic in his argument in saying that, well, maybe it's the NDE, even though it's hallucinatory, that's causing this life change. It's like, I don't know how you get out of that circle there then.
Yeah, people in general, all other hallucinatory events, dreams, all other temporary, transient, even pathological alterations of consciousness are essentially never going to result in that high a percentage of people experiencing them go on and have those types of profound life changes that we see in near-death experiencers. And moreover, what you see in the life changes of near-death experiencers is markedly consistent. In other words, it's not just that they have life changes, it's the consistency of those life changes. In other words, the substantial majority, if not overwhelming majority, of near-death experiencers believe that there's an afterlife. They believe that there's a God. They no longer fear death, less materialistic, value-loving relationships, more, and the list goes on and on. Consistently observed not only in the INDERF study, but from scores of prior scholarly studies of this phenomenon over 30 years.
Here's the last point that I guess I wanted to talk about, because it's the capstone on this whole thing. And we were chatting a little bit about it before the interview began, and that's that how do you come to terms with the evidence? The way I always think of it is jump over that chasm, because you're a non-believer and you have this kind of materialistic world and things work out the way you like them to. But at some point, some of us, and I've gone through this process, and I can't tell you how many folks I've spoken with who said, I was very skeptical, I was there, and then at some point, I just became convinced by the evidence. And it's like jumping over this chasm and nothing ever looks the same. And this, I guess, is really what Skeptiko is all about. For me, that transformation came about through the cumulative effect of just looking at the data. I didn't have any big experience. I just kept looking at the data. And I think in the prior interview I had with you, you mentioned that your path wasn't too dissimilar from that. I mean, it was really the data that convinced you rather than, you didn't have an NDE or no one close to you had an NDE. So do you want to speak to that process of change that you've seen people go through?
Oh, absolutely. As a physician that fights cancer, I'm very evidence-based. And in fact, I require strong evidence before I'm going to make any therapeutic decisions in my professional life. And for my understanding of near-death experience, I had exactly the same standards. I'm a real show-it-to-me kind of person anyway. So I really had to see evidence and had to see overwhelmingly strong evidence before I was going to be convinced. And with the evidence that I've presented in the book, Evidence of the Afterlife, to me and to vast numbers of other people, and believe me, I've received hundreds of correspondences, and certainly that seems to be a very strong consensus among people that have read the book, is that the evidence is compelling for the reality of near-death experience and its consistent message of an afterlife. For me, I am absolutely clear, absolutely certain that there's a wonderful afterlife for all of us.
And what do you think about folks that you run into that just can't seem to get there, can't seem to really get there with regard to the evidence? Any thoughts on that? Because I know you've encountered plenty of them.
Yeah, and that was brought out with your interview with Dr. Woerlee, where you would consistently bring up evidence that Dr. Woerlee simply would not address. I think one of the biggest defense types of things that people have that don't believe in an afterlife and don't believe this kind of evidence is there's sort of that barrier where they just won't hear it. They won't respond to it. It's just not something that they care to address, which is somewhat surprising. I think all scholarly discussion of really any topic really requires a open-minded dialogue about the evidence. It really starts with evidence. So I think that's where part of it is. I think the other issue I've seen with other skeptics, and again, talking in general about skeptics in general from a variety of paranormal experiences, is they really, they'll often have their pet theory, and their theory is, how the world works, how things work, and it's very, very difficult to dislodge them from whatever their pet theory might be, even in the face of overwhelming evidence. And Alex, that's why there's over 20 different skeptical so-called explanations of near-death experience. The reason that there are so many so-called explanations is that no one or several of these alternative explanations make sense, even to the skeptics. And you actually have a great case report on that right on Skeptiko. Note when we interviewed Kevin Nelson, who had his theory for near-death experience, that being REM intrusion, notice not once did he mention how chest compressions might cause consciousness that lead to near-death experiences resulting. Just talked about REM intrusion, but notice that Dr. Woerlee never once mentioned anything about REM intrusion, and he simply had his pet theory about chest compression. So this is kind of an interesting thing. I think skeptics can fairly easily see the logical flaws and the inadequacy of other skeptics' theories in explaining the evidence, but they seem to cling rigorously to their own theory. It's a very interesting phenomenon. I've seen this over and over.
That is a very interesting point. And you could even go one step further when we interviewed Dr. Michael Persinger, and his pet theory, if you will, were that EEG didn't actually measure brain activity, and that was easily refuted, and then no one else would even go there because it doesn't make a lot of sense. But you talk there for a minute about skeptics, and what is particularly fascinating to me about the NDE experience and the NDE research is that it generates an equally unexplainable ability to kind of look past the data from people we normally associate with as being believers. And that's what I saw with your interview with Bill O'Reilly. Here's a guy who wants to come out right up front and says, I'm a Catholic. I know your data can't be right because it doesn't fit with my belief system over there. And I've interviewed some I've interviewed some folks too, some Christian folks, very, likable folks, and you get to the NDE data and they get halfway there, only to the part that supports what they already believe. They say, I believe the NDE shows that there's heaven and God and Jesus is there. Please don't show me any data that would suggest there's anything different than that.
Yeah, I got to jump in on that. First of all, with regards to Bill O'Reilly, he is just a brilliant, tough interview person. Bill O'Reilly actually loved the interview. He told me that he'd read Evidence of the Afterlife, and I believe it. What's interesting is after the Bill O'Reilly show, he posted my interview on his website as the first video out of 20. Everybody accessing his website automatically started my interview with him playing, and the heading that was put by, presumably with Bill O'Reilly's permission or with somebody in charge of the website was words to the effect of, new book provides strong evidence of an afterlife. So again, sometimes you have to, overlook the actual interview and realize that really obviously made a very great impression. And certainly Bill O'Reilly was a lot more affected by the book than the interview might have represented. The other thing that's interesting is that here in Houma, which is a religious conservative area of the country, very, very deep south, the people that are aware of my book and have read it are absolutely fascinating. I mean, almost uniformly, people are that have read the book and understand the evidence are getting that this is an important contribution to the afterlife, to understanding the afterlife question. It's been, I think, a shift in that over the last few years. In fact, I was recently talking with Dr. Raymond Moody, who first coined the term near-death experience in 1975 in his groundbreaking book, Life After Life, and he agrees. Both of us are seeing just over the last few years a real shift, a real openness for people really of all religious backgrounds to really be a lot more open to the evidence of near-death experience than ever before. Now, atheists still, of course, are going to have a huge problem with it, but virtually everybody else seems to be very, very open.
I think that's probably true, but there is a lot of shading of the experience where they take in as much only that part that doesn't conflict with, where they're coming from. I don't know if you've encountered that, but I certainly had. I interviewed not too long ago Dr. Gary Habermas, who is a really, really nice guy, delightful guy, authored of more than 30 books and has appeared on numerous movies and TV shows, and has done a substantial amount of research of near-death experience. But again, a guy who will only go so far as to say, yeah, I'm okay with the afterlife part, just don't tell me that it might conflict with my book, my doctrine, my very narrowly held belief.
Well, I think with anybody, and again, speaking in general, if you've got a belief system that you absolutely know is correct, then any evidence to the contrary is certainly very difficult to hear, very difficult to accept, no matter how profound the evidence is. And I think we see that over and over. And it just creates a barrier to communication. But again, I think that as time goes on, there's less and less people that are that rigidly holding on to belief systems. I think more and more people are inquiring, they're searchers. I think they're open to saying, well, what evidence is there in the world, both for and against an afterlife? And it's people like that have questions like that, inquiring minds, openness, reasonable openness, that want to know about evidence. That's where my book, Evidence of the Afterlife, comes in.
Dr. Long, what's coming up for you in the near future?
Well, just going to think about doing a second book, given the tremendous response to my first book and the fact it became a New York Times bestseller. I'm really starting to look into near-death experiences deeper, and I'm starting to look at the experiences that are related to near-death experiences. And certainly I've got a mammoth amount of data, and I think the time over the next probably several years is going to come along where I'm going to want to start writing that down, and that will be another very interesting, very exciting book as well.
Great. Well, thank you so much for coming back on and dealing with this topic in such depth. For those of us who really like to look at the science and tear things apart logically, it's been a great help.
Well, appreciate the kind words, and I certainly enjoy talking with you, certainly have a great deal of respect for the work you're doing, and I think all of us working together, I think over time we're going to help have some of these important truths and important understandings brought to the world.
Thanks again to Dr. Long for joining me today on Skeptiko. Now that I've gotten his responses, I'm going to go back to Dr. Woerlee and see if any further follow-up discussion is possible or would be meaningful. So please stick around for that. And if you're interested in this show, any of the previous shows, please check out the Skeptiko website. It's at skeptiko.com. You'll find those links to all our previous shows. There's close to 100 of them by now. You'll also find an email link for me. My Facebook link is there. You can connect with me that way. And a link to our forums where you can join in a discussion about some of the topics you've heard about. Well, that's going to do it for today. I have several other episodes, quite a few actually, building up in the hopper, and I'm just trying to get those out as quickly as I can. So stick around, much more to come. Until next time, bye for now.